What's up, everybody? Welcome to my latest live stream here on Logical, Plausible, Probable. In this discussion, I'm going to talk about some elements of the fine-tuning argument in relation to intelligent design and ultimately the likelihood of God's existence. But what really inspired me to do this broadcast was I was reading through some papers on the whole premise of the fine-tuning argument and came across one that's considered very well respected. And as I was scrolling through, and they were, considering the different arguments in favor of the intelligent agent being required, something that I found very, very interesting was a very simple line, but it was all about how the fine-tuning argument in terms of the intelligent creator has basically been debunked by, or can be eliminated because of Darwinism and evolution explains life. Therefore, a fine-tuner is not needed. And when I read that, I was like, wow. It's those of you who've watched my videos and seen my debates know that I'm making the argument that no, life could not exist without the intelligent agent, and going all the way back to the abiogenesis component, which obviously extrapolate that improbable abiogenesis out to the fine-tuning of the universe as well. But the fact that the authors of this paper, which I'll get into in just a minute, the fact that they viewed Darwinism as the relative be-all, end-all, hey, let's toss out the whole concept of a designer being the most reasonable conclusion, it really struck me that, wow, this is amazing evidence for the level to which Darwinian theory has plagued thought and also removed rationality from the it really removed rationality from the argument. And one of my favorite lines is, it's made all of this fruit of a poison tree. And it's when you look at the math of all of the different requirements for the fine-tuning on the cosmological level, and then you look at all of the improbabilities for the fine-tuning of the on the biological level, but beyond just the fine-tuning, the organized structure that goes against the entire premise of deterministic chemistry being the fundamental requirement that we can infer from what we are observing. It's, as I said in my my video the other day about 4 ways to trigger an atheist. It's mention the intelligent design argument, but then when you go to my atheist fantasyland projection complex symptoms, number 1 I have is suspension of critical thinking, and something that many of us in this on this side of the argument oftentimes make is that if you're not going to answer abiogenesis but rely on evolution as the supposed answer for our very existence, then I'm sorry, but you are suspending a huge component of logic and evidentiary analysis that really needs to be considered. So kind of dive into this. So their number 4 point: critiquing the inference of design from fine-tuning. The idea that cosmic fine-tuning originates in design by something like an intelligent creator fits into a long-standing Judeo-Christian tradition, where both the cosmos and biology were explained in that way. Now that biology has yielded to the theory of evolution proposed by Darwin and Wallace in the mid-19th century, the battleground has apparently moved back to the cosmos. So you can, and then they go into go beyond that, but pretty much that is the the foundation. It's evolution explains life, therefore the only potential evidence for God relies in the cosmological arguments. And if we can come up with some relative explanation for that, then all evidence for God is completely removed. And then you can get into things like where they say, first, in slightly different ways, Smith and Barnes, quoting some papers, both made the point that the fine-tuning argument does not claim or support the conclusion that the present universe is optimal for intelligent life. Indeed, it hardly seems to be, even granted all the fine-tuning in the world, as well as the existence of our Earth with its relatively favorable conditions. Evolution has been walking a tightrope so as to produce as much as jellyfish, not to speak of primates. This alone casts doubt on the fine-tuning argument as an argument of design, for surely a benign creator would prefer a universe optimal for life rather than one that narrowly fits it. From a theistic perspective, it would seem far more efficient to have a cosmic architecture that is robust for its designated goal. So to me, when you really think about the arguments that are being made by the atheists and the evolutionists and all of these different folks that we interact with on a very regular basis, it's if you've completely removed one of the fundamental components for the ability to even have these discussions, in this context, abiogenesis, from the equation, in order to suspend an entirely different range of evidence. There's no other context in which that would be considered a rational or logical, plausible, or probable, as I always love to say, position to be taking. And then you get into them supposedly explaining all of these fine-tuning components of the universe, from the multiverse theory and all these different rabbit holes they want to go down to that are completely hypothetical, by the way. Like, hey, if it was this and this and this and this and this, and we had relative infinity to work with, then what is so categorically improbable that it's reasonable to consider it impossible is no longer impossible, because we have an infinite set of chances to make all this work. Hey, what's up, Refined Living? Victor, appreciate y'all stopping by. Sorry, just switch back over to the video, or to StreamYard. See, I was reading from that paper and going on a little long-winded tangent there. But everything that I'm talking about here really leads you down the thought process of, are the atheists so desperate to avoid facing the obvious conclusion, the rational one, the one that shows what's emo? What's up, emo? God is also hypothetical. You obviously are missing the entire point that I am making the argument that from rational inference based on the observable evidence, the hypothetical of God is showing a direct reason for that conclusion, whereas you have zero evidence for a multiverse, and the improbability both of the universe, existence of the universe, as well as from the evolutionary foundational arguments. Hey, the universe is not tuned for life. Life shouldn't exist here, yet it does. Therefore, the improbable can happen without the intelligent agent. You have so many hypotheticals that must fit into your worldview in order to explain our existence, while simultaneously supposedly disproving our position that it is the more reasonable conclusion that the designer does exist, because based on evidence and based on rational thinking and comparison to anything else that has the variables that we're talking about in the context of life, would require an intelligent agent. And this is why I think things like biocomputing are so fascinating, as humans are currently creating biocomputers that leverage the processes of existing biology to perform computations that have input output based on what we have structured it to be, but claim simultaneously that the exact same biocomputation logic that is occurring in biology did not require a designer, when I literally dare any atheist to go find somebody who is working in biocomputing and bioinformatics and ask them directly if they think that any of the circuitry that and the logic rules and the syntax that they have reprogrammed things to operate into could ever have occurred without their direct influence, and if it was remotely easy for them to do so with the end goal in mind, a predefined outcome they had already determined was going to be their objective, and they couldn't pull it off, or can only pull off a fraction of what they are attempting to accomplish, yet at the same time argue that random undirected process somehow was the result of circuitry which is exponentially more complicated and more functional and has greater end outcome variability than anything that we have ever come up with. But then you're going to say that I believe in just a hypothetical creator? Well, let's think about this, Emo, and all of you other atheists. Let's say in a cave somewhere, buried inside of rock, which we carbon date to be 10 million years old, so prior to the evolution per your timeline of intelligent humans, and we found a hard drive in there. And when we accessed the hard drive, after determining that it was operating in binary and then determining which of the programming languages were used to execute it, we then stated that the code that was enabling all of the software that was operating on this hard drive somehow created itself, because there was no intelligent humans back then. Therefore, how could a hard drive, and B, all of the software and all of the programming that they found on it come into existence without the intelligent agent? And then B, they argued that somehow the hardware had also created itself, the compilers and the hard drive and the circuitry and all the silicone. Oh wait, silicone is a naturally occurring substance. Oh wait, somehow this has been converted into a microchip. Would you actually argue that somehow that could come into existence without an intelligent agent? Okay, yeah, you're going to go on to that one too. Okay, your logic doesn't follow. Even though it takes complicated refrigerators to generate ice, it doesn't follow that ice needs an intelligent agent. No, but an ice cube or an ice sculpture does. I don't understand how people like you, Emo, and all of your little other atheist buddies argue that because a natural process can be leveraged to have an end outcome, that means that there's not an impetus that has foreknowledge of the desired outcome being required to leverage that natural process to that end outcome. I mean, because by your logic, the fact that the internal combustion engine uses the chemical process of internal combustion to generate the heat and the pressure to spin the turbines and the pistons, or spin the pistons to create the mechanical force to move a vehicle. Yes, all those things fall under the auspice of natural forces, physics and chemistry being leveraged to have the end outcome of a technology. However, Emo and all of you other little atheists out there who think this is somehow not directly comparable to what is happening in biology, life is leveraging natural forces and processes in a very structured, prescriptive, deterministic way, which requires end outcome objectives for a formal end product. And to argue that, oh man, an ice cube could form through natural forces. Yes, the ice could turn into ice. The water could not turn into a beautiful sculpture of a swan. And Emo and all of you other atheists out there, I would love to hear your response to how you think that water, because it follows the natural forces, turning into freezing when it gets to a certain temperature and the atoms stop vibrating at the same level so it forms into a solid state. How does that have any relevance to what the end outcome is executed by the intelligent agent. And to me, when you really start to look at things from both the cosmological and the biological level, when you look at the intricacies and the beauty and the components that are dependent upon spatiotemporal variables to have the end outcome that is fundamental to life, I mean, to conclude that all of that just because, oh, wow, chemicals bond together. Oh, wow. Well, that's just astounding. Yeah, so I guess for example, in 2016, the nano car race, the first one they had in the world. I think it was 6 or 7 different teams got together. They built out molecular nano cars that literally had things like wheels that turn, but they were made out of molecules and they were powered by protons. I mean, okay, cool. So are you going to suggest that just because they used chemistry to create a molecular car and they chose gold as a very smooth surface that they polished down so that it was soft enough for the wheels that they had created to be able to bind and pull itself along this surface? Are you going to suggest that all of the logic and the foreknowledge of the desired outcome and the understanding of physics and chemistry that were required for them to even create these structures in the first place, to then be able to power them through protons? I honestly question your sanity if you come to the conclusion where the processes which they followed in order to achieve their end outcome, I think they were able to move like 7 nanometers an hour, which is nothing compared to all sorts of the transport proteins that operate inside of our bodies. I mean, just think about the arguments that you're making. It follows natural process, therefore no creator was required. Cool. Well, the winners from Rice University, when they had to submit the documentation of how they were able to structure all this, it was 382 tightly spaced pages of the processes by which they were able to create this end outcome of a nano car that could be powered by protons. So when you consider the premise that no rational scientist would conclude that those nanocars could exist without the intelligent agents of extremely high level intellectuals and specialists in synthetic chemistry, those things could never form. Yet they argue that things such as the helicase, which is fundamentally required for the unzipping of DNA and the whole transcription process, which is exponentially more complicated, exponentially more powerful, somehow came into existence without the requirement of an intelligent agent, even though the instructions are formally prescribed into the genetic sequences which are leveraged to result in the helicase. So, I mean, let's think about this for one moment, folks. As I mentioned, for this very simplistic nanocar, there were 382 pages of processes they had to follow. In the context of helicase or polymerase, you have the information for this in extremely compact, well-structured, syntactically structured form inside of the DNA, which is then transcribed in mRNA, which is then taken to the ribosome to be executed. And then atheists want to say, oh, okay, gotcha. Yeah, it just goes through a chemical process it's deterministic in the ribosome. But you don't even talk about the information requirements and the structure and the predetermined outcome that was required for the ribosome to be able to execute the helicase. And then you don't think about the other factors in the transcription complex, which also had to have the information ready for them, because they all work together and they can't work independently of each other in order for life to exist. And then you want to go down these completely irrational supposed logic streams of, undirected process can somehow result in these things. Really? Well, then how so, if we are now finding beyond doubt that point mutations cause death, point mutations, single variabilities cause fatalities. They cause complete and utter collapse of a protein or a variety of other biological functions. So you're going to argue that when we know one change collapses function, without even explaining how the original function came into existence in the first place, you now extrapolate that out to say that, even though this one change and this, these slow mutations over time will somehow result in brand new functionality, how the hell did you get to the new functionality? How do you get to the new functionality? Explain it to me. Because, hey, cool, these 2 or 3 modifications that were made, they collapsed the ability for the organism to survive. It died. So how did it reproduce? How did it pass on the fitness that you guys so love to talk about? In the context of, back to the foundational point of this, evolution somehow removes intelligent agents from the equation? Really? You rely on a completely unproven, unsubstantiated, hypothetical frozen accident to explain abiogenesis, when in the lab, we can't get more than about 60 to 65 nucleotides to bind together without collapse. Emo, are you saying all point mutations collapse the function of protein? No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that mutations that have in places that have been taken for granted are now being shown beyond doubt to cause fatality. I mean, I don't know if you haven't read a paper on cancer recently, but huge portions of that have absolutely nothing to do with the protein sequences. They're all in the non-coding, supposedly junk regions of the Dawkinses of the world, who claim that it's all direct evidence for your evolutionary theories that you guys rely upon. Then you get into structural biology, and we find out that, oh my goodness gracious, these things that we thought were completely irrelevant, actually, if this non-coding region is modified geographically or deleted, then it either dramatically alters in a negative fashion or forbids the execution of different coding functions. I mean, when the stupidity of the myopic view of people such as Emo and this Blaster Master who's claiming I have the Dunning-Kruger effect, I honestly wonder if you guys have the capacity, because of your atheistic worldview, to view things from a big picture perspective rather than to look at things from such a myopic level you can't see the forest for the trees, as the saying goes. I mean, you're attempting to explain prescriptive information, engineering structure, nanotech, and all of these things somehow coming into existence without an intelligent agent through natural process that we, as intelligent agents, looking at it, can't recreate. I just want you to think about that for just a second. You can't recreate it as humans in the lab. We can't recreate things that we are looking at. And then you want to argue that somehow something that we cannot recreate, even though we're looking at it, somehow popped into existence because it uses natural processes such as chemistry and physics in order to have the end outcome. Well, cool. Let's think about that in the context of a painting. Are there natural physical processes at work in order for a painting to exist? Yes. Both in the paint, in the creation of the canvas, in the physics that is used by the artist in order to create the painting in the first place. Yet, I don't think that, even though there's a bunch of natural forces in place that are being leveraged to have that end outcome, are you suggesting and are you arguing that somehow that could have come into existence without the intelligent agent? And if you don't extrapolate that back in the context of our very existence, both from a life on Earth perspective as well as into the the universe itself, then you are closing your mind to an extraordinary amount of the obvious. And I love the stupidity of people like Blaster Master. Why don't you publish a peer-reviewed paper? I'm not really sure how that has any relevance to whether or not my arguments are sound. And I oftentimes tell people like you, why don't you go find a PhD, present the argument of could they recreate X in relation to biology? And I know beyond doubt they will say no. They will say, oh, well, we can modify it a little bit. We can make, some of our own variations, but no, we cannot recreate the fundamental components that are required for life to exist. It's beyond us. In fact, we barely comprehend how they work in the first place. And which is why I get so, this is all part of the reason I get so adamant in my arguments that atheists are refusing to even consider anything that challenges their worldview. If in any other context, the positions that you, not me, you try to, and this is why I talk about the atheist fantasyland projection complex, you project that I and people like me are the ones living in a fantasy land and not using logic and reason to reach our conclusions based on the evidence. You always argue about empirical evidence. Where's the empirical, repeatable, testable evidence? Well, okay, well, let's ask that same question to you. Repeat evolution. I play softball with a local biologist. Yeah, okay. If he's an Evo-Devo, he's probably not thinking about things from a chemical level. Go ask that guy if he or anybody he knows could recreate the helicase, number one. Number two, ask him if they could possibly, with nothing but amino acids and technology, if they could bind all of the appropriate nucleotides required into a synthetic piece of DNA, and if they could somehow, with nothing but amino acids to work with, and the known sequence for the variety of the 70 to 80 parts of a ribosome, if they could bind all those amino acids together in order to create a ribosome. Then ask them if they could do the exact same thing with the design requirements already in existence, because we have sequenced the genetic code. Go ask them if they can recreate that. I will await your response, because I know beyond doubt they will say no, and they will readily admit that no, we cannot. So if you think that just because your biologist buddies don't believe in it because they have been utterly brainwashed with, hey, we're not even going to think about abiogenesis, number one. Hey, we're not even going to think about the fact that our entire premise of evolution is founded upon undirected mutations over time, which is collapsing in on itself in discoveries with structural biology and other components that we're learning on the absolute collapse, and then the improbabilities and the rarities of functional proteins. And you just extrapolate all of these things out, and you wonder why people like myself question your critical thinking skills. I mean, it's getting to the level of people like Biff the Rhombus, because Christianity claims he exists and expects to be recognized without any evidence. Well, I guess I'm assuming you came in late here, because the evidence is staring you in the face. And the only reason that people such as yourself don't recognize it as evidence is because it requires you to actually use rational thought other than, I didn't see it be created, therefore there was no creator. I mean, that is what is being argued. And then it's extrapolated to atheists are unconvinced of the Christian God's existence. Right. And what atheists don't seem to be able to comprehend, as exemplified in my debate with Smokey Saint versus Michael the Canadian Atheist and Religionist BS last week, is that atheists seem only capable of arguing religion. They do not have the capacity, apparently, to argue the premise of theism and the intelligent agent being required. You want to argue it on a level below, which is, which religion is correct, not does God exist, which is the fundamental question. Because whether or not it's another standard atheist talking point. It's not their job to prove he doesn't exist, because it's not possible to prove the supernatural doesn't exist. Yeah, those standard points crack me up when you can absolutely prove beyond all doubt in any other context other than biology and the existence of our universe that there are plenty of things that are not possible without the intelligent agent, which in this context, like a human, we could be considered the supernatural in context of turning a bowl of water into a sculpture of a swan. We are the supernatural agent in that point, because no natural process other than the execution of our sentient consciousness could result in the outcome of water turning into a carved swan. I mean, it's so funny how atheists seem incapable of recognizing this exact premise is extrapolated not from God of the Gaps mindset, but from it being the rational conclusion based on direct observation, which is there is no other way in which things that cannot be created, when we try to do it on purpose with knowledge of chemistry and physics, and you have the template to work with, and you can't recreate something. I mean, and you think that the natural selection somehow, with none of that knowledge, by the way, I mean, I don't think any atheists conclude that nature has knowledge of the future. Do you? Because if you do, it sounds like nature is your God, and nature would have to have sentience if nature has foreknowledge of end outcomes of chemical processes and also understands the laws of physics and chemistry. So unless you're going to argue that nature has sentience, then the logical conclusion is that there is a sentient, intelligent agent required to have the knowledge of those forces and the desired end outcome in order for life to exist. So to argue that the fine-tuning argument on the cosmological level is not valid because something that is completely implausible to occur without an intelligent agent happened on Earth, and that's your worldview, that the fundamental structures of the laws of physics that enable the universe to exist and are fine-tuned to allow for its existence didn't require foreknowledge is amazingly, it's so small-minded that it's, again, as I joke on a regular basis, and I said it's a joke, but it's also serious. The only way you can be an atheist is to have suspended all rational thought. It's nuts. Anyway, that's enough of my rant for now. I know Emo is over there dying to get on and talk to me. Let's see here. Let me. All right, Emo. You can come on. That's we're gonna talk for a few more minutes. But anyway, that was my Sunday at noon rant. It just cracks me up how on a daily basis, we come across more and more evidence that screams that a designer was required. And on a daily basis, the atheists, with greater and greater force, required, because to admit otherwise shatters the entire worldview of, which one is the more logical, plausible, and probable conclusion. And if you're going to argue, and people like Blastmaster and other folks do this, if you're going to argue that one component is not enough to prove a position, but then you ignore the other 99 and then claim that the person who has presented 100 arguments or 100 pieces of evidence for their conclusion is somehow not being rational and is ignoring the evidence. I'm like, if that's not the definition of projection, I don't know what is. You literally refuse to look at the big picture or to comprehend the big picture, or perhaps you lack the capacity to understand the big picture. And if that is so, then so be it. But for people of a modicum of intellect, if in any other context you said that, this plethora of elements that all in any other context would require an intelligent agent to exist somehow do not require an intelligent agent in this specific context, I mean, you've shattered all expectations of being treated seriously from me. I mean, it's at this point, you guys are, the atheists are actively attempting to suppress people's appreciation for their existence, to divide the world into the closed-minded and the open-minded. And that's what cracks me up too about the very often the atheist worldview. They accuse anybody who believes in God of being closed-minded when they literally take it to the extreme of things such as anti-theism, where I don't even want you to be able to consider if there's more to your existence than the physical. I mean, just think about that for a second. I want to convince you there is nothing to your existence beyond this finite period of time you have in the mortal coil. That's it. There's nothing else relevant, nothing else to consider. And yet you claim to be the ones that are open-minded? Wow. I actually consider my existence, and from the perspective of there is more, number one. Number two, I should help other people. Number three, after I shuffle off the mortal coil, I then get to experience the magnitude of existence on an entirely different plane without fear of death. I mean, that's a fairly dynamic difference in worldview. What's up, Emo?
Hey, what's up, man? Good?
Yeah, what's going on?
Oh, I'm fine. I have a bit of an accent. I'm not too sure if you can get what I'm saying.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, okay, good. Where do I start? I guess we would start with evolution, I guess. In terms of the common design, common descent arguments. Regardless of if you don't accept universal common ancestry, you do accept some level of it, right?
Is that a question or a rhetorical statement?
I'm just asking, like, as to what level would you accept common descent, and where you think it breaks down?
So obviously you're going to try and go down the whole what is a kind rabbit hole, and where's the line of demarcation between micro and macro evolution. And I don't personally know exactly where the line is. I would say it's somewhere in the vicinity of family, the potentially genus, but definitely does not go above family. And when you look at the rapidly growing discoveries about the limits to adaptations and modifications that are and interspeciations of inside of family groups, and the acknowledged cap points on where these things can expand to. I mean, the evidence is growing in my favor that there are dramatic limits to what you refer to as evolution. You're back on mute, Emo.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that. My bad. Yeah. So, the line per se is not necessary. It's not like even if there was a line, one would be able to definitively draw it. But in the case of evolution, for example, you were making an argument, or you were discussing something that there seems to be a limit on the amount of change or variety you can get within a species or a genus or whatever. And are you familiar with, for example, the evolution of Brassica Oleracea?
I don't know the exact Greek name, but I'm assuming this is probably the broccoli or cauliflower or whatever you were ranting about the other day.
Right. So the cauliflower, broccoli, and all those things are radically distinct forms. However, they would derive from one single common ancestor, and that is a demonstration. Why? That was done.
I'm assuming your argument is going that they took on they had a morphological change. Therefore, that must be evidence for your evolutionary model, right?
Right. Well, it would be evidence that organisms can change. Not universal common descent. We're not concluding universal common descent, but we're just trying to see how much evolution would be reasonably acceptable.
Well,
in that sense.
Hang on, man. You're echoing.
Oh, sorry. I have to mute myself.
Okay, so I'm going to directly address your organisms can change point here, because ironically, it doesn't actually work in your favor, even if the modification from a visual perspective can be significant. It actually leans in my favor of pre-programmed capacity by the intelligent agent. So, for example, are you aware that locusts are actually grasshoppers?
Not fully aware of that.
Okay, so
no.
I'm assuming that you, with your example you're trying to put, is there's this dramatic morphological change, because pretty much all of the supposed evidence for evolution is dramatic morphological changes and body plan structures and stuff. But specifically morphology. I find it ironic, however, that locusts are grasshoppers. And not only are they grasshoppers, they undergo dramatic changes in a very short period of time, in which the grasshopper, based on specific conditions, transforms literally into and physically into the body structure that we and all those components with it that we view as taxonomically as a locust. But it's been discovered that, wow, the genome didn't change at all. It's the exact same genome. It's only being expressed differently. And it's being regulated differently. And yet, it has the capacity to transform into an entirely different visual outcome. And if that scenario in which it's become a locust goes away, it can transform itself back into a grasshopper. So the argument that somehow the ability for morphological change to somehow be evidence for evolution, when the example that I'm talking about here requires the pre-existing capacity in order for this transformation to be undergone, and it can also reverse the exact same transformation back to the original, means that the original genome structure did not go away, and B, that it didn't change to have a completely different view. The only thing that changed was the expression of it. And which is, again, why I find it so ironic that atheists are so heavily reliant on the quote-unquote junk DNA, which, yes, I know that many are starting to acknowledge it, but they're still heavily dependent on it not it being changes to the root that occurred, not modification to the expression of the existing functions. So to put it in context of like a computer, a website, for example, cool. I can have the exact same website. I can write scripts that say, on this day, change the colors to this, hide this page, publish that page, and display this module because we're going to have a sale on such and such a day. I mean, we're talking about literal equivalency in the context of what is happening on the biological level as would be happening in any of our technologies that we're doing. However, I doubt anyone would ever come to the conclusion when they pulled up this website they're familiar with and saw something different, they would never conclude that those changes happened without the requirement of the programmer coming in and making the modification, or having in an earlier date written the logic variables in order to have that outcome. Would you agree or disagree?
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I totally agree with the example you gave before with the locust and the argument you're making here. But the thing is about evolution itself is that it works in a similar fashion, whereby the same genes are kind of reused over and over again. So, for example, the evolution of jaws from gills uses the same genes, pretty much the same set of genes, and they're kind of repurposed to form the jaw of the fish from the ancestrals. So it's the same set of genes and the same set of things going on, not necessarily new things being added, but just a rearrangement of what's already there. So it's similar to what's happening with the locusts or what's happening with Brassica or any evolutionary transition where the genes are pretty much just repurposed over and over again. So it kind of, sometimes I question maybe what we would observe as evolution could all be a result of some kind of pre-programmed system that this designer could have done.
Okay, so quick interjection here as you've talked about repurposing. So I don't know if this is specifically the genes you're referring to, but very often I've heard this argument many times. The Hox genes, for example, are used ad nauseum by atheist activists as supposed evidence for repurposing, as evidence of the supposed anyway, what they are, actually I was reading a paper on this a couple days ago that, oh wait, it turns out that the what we viewed as this supposed repurposing is, in terms of, I'm talking about from the actual gene sequence that they're looking at, where they think is just being repurposed. They're seeing that, oh wait, what hasn't been repurposed is all of the regulatory factors that are dramatically modifying the outcome of this supposedly repurposed gene. So then you go into another level of, okay, cool. So we're going to hyper focus on 1 to 2% of the overall genome. and argue that because these building block components are being used in or exist in different organisms, yet there's massive difference in how they're actually expressed in terms of the outcome, somehow is evidence for undirected evolution. When going back to the the website analogy, that's like suggesting that because there's a third of the websites on the internet all use WordPress as their content management system, and many of them use similar plugins, that there wasn't an intelligent agent required for them to exist. And you take it to another level in terms of the pre-programmed aspect. If in the modern era of web development, for example, just building normal websites, you go out and buy a template that has pre-programmed page structures and all these different things, and you can install the which variation you want, and then make modifications from there. That does not remove the requirement of the programmer having been in place prior to this template being used to create a new website. You still had to have the pre-existing components. And this is the whole point that I'm making here, is we have dramatic evidence for the pre-programming being in place, and the supposed repurposing through natural selection is like me saying, oh, I'm looking at the source code of 2 different websites built on WordPress that are using similar plugins. The code variation is only 40%. Therefore, website 1 evolved from website 2. I mean, that's what's being talked about. Oh, hey, here's the evolutionary timeline that must have happened, and here's the mutations that must have occurred in order to get from A to B. We're not observing them. We're postulating that they must have occurred in order to result in the outcome that we're currently observing. But the reason I'm using this kind of comparison is I don't think that any rational human would, A, come to the conclusion that that could occur, and B, would not intuitively recognize that whether it was the same or 2 different people, there were intelligent agents behind the generation of that source code. And anyway, I've been ranting for a while. Go ahead and respond to that, Nemo.
Oh, that's okay. Okay. See, the argument of the code and so on. It's. I'm not saying it's a flawed argument. It's a good argument for where it is for talking about code. But in living systems, it seems like if that argument is applied, then it kind of fades away, because what happens is organisms do indeed evolve, and you can trace common ancestry. For example, creationists themselves would accept a certain amount of common ancestry, so the code does vary even within the kinds. For example,
expression of code is varied. Not
right, the expression of the code, not the source code. Okay, fine. Well, that's a similar thing with evolution, whereby the core genes that would code for a specific body plan per se would be always conserved. So, for example, the tetrapod body plan, or the Hox genes that would be responsible for that, would be conserved amongst all tetrapods, with variations, of course, but the core genes that would code for that would be conserved. The question would be, where does this kind of thing breaks down in respect to biology, and how can we kind of identify the descendants of an original source code? So how do we, for example, are all felines, for example, are they descended from a single source code, or is it separate source codes that of similar origin or similar design, but that led to that diversity? So that's what the question. That's a question I am trying to get answered, in which we try to identify the descendants of an original design.
Okay, so in two responses. Number one, when you look at the variations to the source code, there's a reason that machine learning and artificial intelligence is inspired by and is attempting to emulate what we're observing in biological function. So if you have the capacity to vary based on new variables that modify or adapt to a specific environment, you still have to have the pre-existing capacity to do so. And I would argue that no one in their right mind would conclude that a AI machine learning system that was created by humans could ever have come into existence without an intelligent agent, even if that AI was able to make an adaptation, right? Which we're observing. I mean, we're seeing them happen all the time, right? In terms of technology. So that's number one. Number two, in the context of descendancy, right? So let's apply machine learning to a pre-existing loaded template with a bunch of different variations. If just because I don't have something turned on at the moment, and you continue to use the website analogy, let's say there's this business website template has pre-existing presets for 6 different business types. You have made just because you have number 1 activated doesn't mean that the other 9 don't exist. And if you're applying now from the one of the common points that the atheists always love to make is, oh, there's no it doesn't reproduce, therefore you can't make this comparison. I'm like, okay, fine. We're applying machine learning to this point, and now you're going to activate. You're copying it, which is no problem. And now you're going to initiate, based on demand, a new pre-existing function option. Doesn't mean that this one just popped into existence. It was already there. It just wasn't being expressed, which is exactly what we're observing in the in biology. We're observing that exact comparison. And welcome back, Emo. Sorry we lost you there.
Yeah, sorry about that, man. Internet on the island, that's how it is.
Yeah, were you able to hear what I was saying?
I did get part of it. You were talking about that. Basically, I was getting that the information basically to a lot of variants that happen already built in, and I think I got the end part. We were saying that it doesn't follow that just as something changed that it popped in. It could be that it was already there.
Right. So and this is where it goes from the the higher level pre-existing templates, right, for the different possible variations. There wasn't all 10 of them weren't simultaneously active. It doesn't mean that the requirements for all 10 didn't exist. And then when you're thinking about this in the context of machine learning, and this is where epigenetic markers and all this kind of things I find so fascinating, is we are rapidly discovering that a gigantic portion of the things that were considered this is evidence for the neo-Darwinian modern synthesis model, and then we're finding out, oh wait, these are actually the result of not changes to the gene sequence, but to markers that can come in dynamically. And we have the whole premise of read, write, and erase proteins that come in and modify well, do that, read, write, and erase epigenetic markers that are the cause of these modifications that evolutionists love to scream are supposedly evidence of their model, when they're not even associated with their model. It actually works against them. I've been ranting, Emo. Go ahead.
Well, the thing is, the information within species, information in species, with even within the families, are not necessarily conserved. You can actually get new genes, and you can get new biochemical pathways and so on evolving in species within families. For example, just take the family Hominidae with the humans and apes and so on. You do have new genes and so on evolving in that lineage, even within the felines or dogs or whatever family you can think about. It's not like if they were originally placed there. It doesn't seem to be the case. That for example, if you do like phylogenetics, that's something I don't see creationists doing too much of. They can kind of map to see how the genome was changed over time. I'm sorry about that. Could you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh no. Am I on? Yeah, I can hear you. Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, so when in the practice of phylogenetics, you can map genomes to see how they've changed over time. For example, the Brassica and so on, it's not like if they were originally designed to diversify that way. They had a couple polyploidies where the genome duplicated, and it gave them extra quote unquote information to change in their leaf shapes and patterns and so on. So they couldn't do it in their original state until the polyploidy took place, and then they got the ability to change. The same thing, for example, with garlics and onions. Garlics are just modified onions, a cluster of onions in a bulb, and they too had some modification that allowed them to, instead of being a single bulb, cluster into multiple bulbs and then to become a garlic. Am I on?
Yeah, I'm listening to you.
Right. So it seems that even if we assume design, it seems that the designer not only designs pre-existing function into genomes, but he designs them in a way that they can also gain new functions in that sense. And then that opens up the door now to the possibility of a designer who can pretty much pre-program any lineage to diversify in any way he wanted to. Because again, he's unlimited. So we can have, for example, all mammals being descended from one mammal archetype, where the pre-programmed information would be built in, and built in with the capacity to change and so on to facilitate the evolution of mammals. Or we can have that with the evolution of tetrapods and so on. And that would actually explain why we see this kind of pattern in evolution that seems to follow that kind of bifurcating process. We're not doing away with the design.
I assume you are relying on the nested hierarchies argument to defend your position, right?
Right, not just nested hierarchies. Anything could generate a nested hierarchy, but a nested hierarchy that is concordant with a bifurcating process. This is the one that evolution generates. No other process can do that other than life and language.
And in the context of life and language, is there, short of a artificial intelligence system that has been created by humans, is there any context in which what you're referring to you would argue could occur undirected?
I mean, in terms of how organisms change over time?
No, you were talking about language and being able to modify over time. I'm saying, if in that context of language with humans, that is a result of our intelligence. If it is adaptations or generation of something new in the context of an artificial intelligence, nobody would argue that an intelligent agent wasn't required for that to exist. So the point I'm making is that when you look at what we are observing from a machine learning biocomputational model and all these other different pieces of at this point in research unarguably information processing communication systems and other components that are executed through biological systems that have the appearance of being exactly comparable to what we are attempting to create ourselves in order to have the same type of capacity that we are observing in life. I mean, right now we're attempting to create non-determinist DNA computers. I don't really understand how you come to the conclusion that because the capacity for this is seen in limited fashion, that the capacity itself to do that somehow came into existence without the original source being an intelligent agent. Go ahead.
Right. So I don't necessarily argue against intelligent design in that way. I do allow for it to be. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Right. So I don't argue that it does not necessitate a intelligent agency. It could be that maybe it was, or maybe it could have been by some natural process yet to be understood. But my argument is basically the source code, because we're trying to find out what the aboriginal designs were, and how do we determine that?
I mean, I'm not really following you on how that's the ultimate question. Like how is the what was the original specific structure of the first type of X? I'm not sure how that is relevant to whether or not the premise of undirected process being able to result in X, Y, and Z is a remotely reasonable train of thought to be heading down. I mean, which is my whole point, is what we're observing appears to be controlled expression of pre-existing function and logic rules that has machine learning capacity. So if you're trying to figure out how all of that happened through an undirected process, I'm not really sure how you're going to find the answer to your question of what was the original if you're not looking for a specific, if you're not looking for something that follows the logic that I'm outlining versus, oh, this just happened through undirected process. Go ahead, Amo.
Right. That's the thing. The ability for organisms to adapt and so on, the information that they have is conserved amongst them. So it doesn't follow that they're unrelated. It could also follow that all life is related just by some original design that had the capacity to diversify that way. So something could have seeded life, and then life diversified that way. But then again, as to what the life was, we try to have to work that out, because there are certain cellular components, for example.
Right. But what is the evidence that you are relying on in context of it must have come from another form? You're relying on the coding regions of the genome, correct?
Well, both coding and non-coding, or they're genetic markers like endogenous retroviral sequences and orphan genes and so on. that can use to trace ancestry that way. So you can get to see which,
Well,
at least which.
the orphan genes don't help for ancestry because they're,
No, well,
I
actually
mean,
they do because
they're novel. I mean, you guys love to use the orphan gene term, but they're completely uh, individual to that particular species. And
right.
we are also rapidly discovering that there are dramatic differences in the non-coding regions versus the coding regions. So the point I'm making is that this supposed this other type, I'm talking about like different families and stuff. Oh, they must have come from each other because they have similar coding genes, even though their non-coding regions are dramatically different. That is, and then when you get into retrotransposons and different things that have for years been used by evolutionists as supposedly evidence for evolution. I was reading a paper literally yesterday. They have identified 11,000 of those that have direct function and a huge percentage of them are directly used during embryo development. So to argue that something that we know now are knowing is fundamental to the organism existing in the first place is somehow evidence of non-functional components of junk DNA that's evidence for evolution when it's being used in the real time and the organism couldn't live without it. I mean, that to me, that is just it's almost laughable to continue for evolutionists to continue to use that those components as supposed defense of their position. Go ahead, man.
All right. So the what I was saying about the orphan genes. Orphan genes are species or lineage specific genes. So each species within a family or within a kind, as you would say, would have their own orphan genes, and then each genus would have their own orphan gene specific to the genus, and then each family would have orphan genes specific to the family, and each order, each class, and so on. So
And
it
is that
doesn't follow that
is
just
that what
because
we're
a
discovering?
species. Yeah, that's actually what we're discovering. Each individual species would have their own individual orphan genes,
Right, and
and then
that's exactly what we're
unique to
discovering.
them. Right. So then, if two species can be related and each having their own orphan genes, it doesn't follow that orphan genes leads to species being unrelated, because related species could have their own individual sets of orphan genes.
Now, see it's when you think about this in the context of a engineer, number one, for the core fundamentals of building a house, for example, it is extraordinarily likely that you're going to see screws, bolts, pipes, wires, drywall, frame, concrete. You're going to see all of those components in just about every house. However, to conclude that the 500 square foot cracker box is quote unquote related to the 20,000 square foot mansion complex because they both have pipes and screws, bolts, wires, drywall, and frame and concrete. I mean, you would never reach that conclusion. Now, you would say, oh, wow, interesting. They have the same, some of the same pieces, but you would never suggest that the 20,000 square foot mansion came from the 500 square foot cracker box. And to take it at another level, you have, because there would be a whole bunch of additional components in the mansion versus the small house. But then when you're talking about orphan genes, well, what are we discovering in context of the number of different controlled outcomes that can result from a single gene sequence? The central dogma of one one gene equals one protein, as I'm sure you're aware, has basically been debunked in over the last since its inception 40 or 50 years ago, whatever it was. That is no longer even remotely considered correct. I mean, it's one gene, one protein. I'm hoping that you don't actually think that, because we all know that's not the case. What we are finding out is that this one gene can be expressed in hundreds, and in some contexts thousands of different ways, to result in different proteins if things such as microRNAs are bound in variable positions on that one gene sequence. Then when it's being actually going through protein synthesis, an entirely different protein comes out. And that goes back to the whole thing of, there's pipes in both of these houses. Cool. Are they the same shape? No. Are they the same length? No. They used for different functions? Yes. But then you're going to argue that Mansion came from Cracker Box because they both have copper pipes. I mean, this is exactly what we are discovering. And that's before you even start getting into, and that's just using microRNA as an example. There's plenty of other regulatory and transcription factor variables that result in similar modifications. So the point I'm making with all this is it goes back to the website analogy of, cool, they're both using WordPress. This one has e-commerce and online classes and does live streaming on it and does all this other stuff. The other one is a simple content website, and it's one page, and it's got some pictures and some text on it. But since they both had WordPress, therefore the big one came from the other one, or they are directly related, other than using the same foundational component. Are you following what I'm trying to say here?
Right, I am following what you're saying, but that would work in an ecosystem where species were seemingly distantly or unconnected. But in the biosphere we have, including the fossil fauna, there doesn't seem to be like a way you can distinguish where the ancestry would end. For example, I don't really want to use plants because it makes no sense talking about species. Okay, for example, palm trees, for example. The argument here for example, if I was to apply that to palm trees, there are like 2,500 plus species of palm trees within the family, and if I was to apply that argument there, would I then conclude that there are palm trees that are unrelated to others, or that they're all related in that sense? Because the thing they're talking about that vary between kinds, for example, they do also vary between species within the kinds. So I find it strange how it's acceptable to change within the kinds, but as soon as you step outside of the family or kind boundary, then that kind of logic is prohibited. Again,
hang on.
Sorry, go ahead.
You're avoiding the point I was making earlier, that a significant percentage of the variation within kinds that you're talking about, that seems to have no limit, does not follow the neo-Darwinian model of evolution. Those variations within kind are the result of modification to expression of the existing genome. So the point I'm making is, you're arguing in the phylogeny and everything, you're arguing that all of these modifications in the terms of the differences must have occurred through undirected mutation, when the differences, the gaps are actually massive in when you actually think about the, okay, if, I mean, for example, Darwin's finches that they're used ad nauseum by atheists and evolutionary defenders. They realized, fast forward 40 years after some scientists went to go examine this, to, proof of Darwinism. Guess what they found out about all those modifications, the beak size and everything? That wasn't mutations. Those are epigenetic variables. I mean, I don't get how people can continue to try and use these variations as evidence of neo-Darwinian theory and modern synthesis when we are discovering that they are the result of something that is categorically not neo-Darwinian modern synthesis. Yet claim that what they rely upon to supposedly defend their phylogeny arguments supposedly is proven by things that we now know do not follow the logic that's required for their own argument, and yet claim that it proves their position beyond doubt. Go ahead, Emo.
Right. So the epigenetic changes are actually part of the modern synthesis. It's not solely due to random mutation and natural selection. That itself is the Darwinism, but the modern synthesis would include the epigenetic changes and so on. And I was describing with Brassica.
Modern synthesis recognizes the changes, but it does not fit modern synthesis. That's why they're coming extended modern synthesis, and there is direct call to completely do away with modern synthesis because of things such as epigenetics. All right, there's this well published in Nature and Royal Society and Oxford Press and everything else. I mean, there's plenty of papers on this exact topic that no, modern synthesis and neo-Darwinism does not account for these things. We have to come up with a whole new model to account for them because our current one does not. Let's make that very clear, because I mean that's been a well-established reality of why the neo-Darwinism is a failure. Now go ahead. Emo, you're on mute, buddy.
Oh yeah, my bad. So yeah, as I was talking about, for example, Brassica, the evolution of the crops I was taught, it's not solely based on epigenetic factors, also mutations that cause the changes to happen. So they kind of work hand in hand. It's not like if the epigenetic changes replace the mutations or the mutations replace epigenetics. So they kind of work together, where the mutations can change gene sequence or even introduce genes into a genome, and then epigenetics would control the regulation and timing and so on. So it's not one replacing the other or one working in absence of the other. They're kind of working together. So that's how evolution progresses.
Right. So you're suggesting that the oh, they're working together. So you're suggesting that all of these things that have now ultimately resulted in all the life forms that we're observing now are dependent upon simultaneous modifications. Is that what you're saying? In multiple different facets. So not slow mutations over time that accumulate and then turn into something else. You're suggesting that different things have to happen at the same time for this modification to occur. Is that correct?
Right. So the changes are happening in concert. Correct.
Well, I think that would lead to things that we're discovering about in context of some of these supposedly undirected modifications. Then you'd have to start looking at the fact that they are now observing real-time gene writing, if you will, being executed by proteins. And I mean, I would say that that is an example of machine learning and real-time adaptation in a controlled process, not the undirected, oh, this happened, and it happened in synchronicity, and for the things such as the epigenetic components that also require the organized function of the read, write, erase proteins, which also have to have prior existed. You're reliant on multiple subvariables all being in place in order for your end outcome to have happened in a undirected process versus a controlled execution of machine learning capacity. So I'm still not really understanding how that supports the Darwinian evolutionary model versus the intelligent design model.
Right. Well, the thing is, well, intelligent design is not necessarily a model. It's I don't even know what to call it. But
don't try and dodge. Though I don't know if it's a model. What's the specific model? I hear that ad nauseum from you guys. Let's address the point I just made.
Right. I'm saying that I can grant you all that what you just said, and it doesn't follow that species are unrelated to each other. It could still be where all species are descended from some primordially designed form. And that would explain why we find, for example, the first, 80% of life history just being microbes, for example. So the designer must have started with the microbial population, for which he would give them all the abilities to change and adapt and so on. And then they would diversify as time goes on. So it doesn't follow that species are unrelated. It just follows that this.
So it sounds to me like, are you conceding that it is more logical, plausible, and probable that even if everything is related, it is more likely that a intelligent agent was required?
Yeah, I can't say most likely. I have to challenge the probability of that.
Okay, well, let's go down that rabbit hole then.
I think that could be the case.
Let's go down that rabbit hole then. So, why do you conclude that it is not more probable that, given all the things that we've been talking about in what is directly being observed, which many of which you are conceding are the case, why is the intelligent agent being required for these, even if it's the original components that have the capacity to do all these things that we're talking about, why is it not more probable that the intelligent agent was required?
Right, because we have no way to work out the probability of an intelligent agency doing that, unless it's maybe some kind of natural agent that we can kind of work out some physical limitations as to the probability of that occurring. But if it's a supernatural agent, then it makes no sense trying to work out the probability of God, for example. So I don't know how to compare the probability.
We're talking about life. We're talking about the intelligent agent being required for life. How do you explain the well-recognized improbability of a life form coming into existence without a intelligent agent through those natural processes which you're referring to?
Well, the improbability of it doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't or it couldn't have happened. It just means that it's highly improbable. But again, I don't argue against intelligent design. You're thinking that I'm arguing against it. I am just
we've shifted the debate. We've shifted to the debate. I am discussing whether or not it is like you said that it is more likely that it is not the result of an intelligent agent in the primordial arena. So let's talk about that. And you said that it's not it's just because there's high improbability, it's not impossible. And I'm suggesting that it is the exact opposite. When you actually look at all of the recognized components that are required for even these microbes to which you're referring to come into existence. And then from the microbes, you still have to have the transformation from the 500 square foot shack to the 20,000 square foot mansion. And that premise that you're referring to being fundamentally dependent on the supposed ancestry derived from having similar coding regions, which only comprise 1 to 2% of the genomes being compared. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry about that. Again, for example, I cited a paper on I think they discovered a protein in a couple of meteorites that seems to be of abiotic origin. But I don't see how you can even work out the probability of that happening if we don't fully understand what was going on back then to work out the probability. Nor do I see it even making sense to work out the probability of life against the probability of an intelligent agent for which there is no physical component to work a probability out for, like a god or something. So I don't try to work out the probability of those things because I don't see it even makes sense to do that or possible to do so.
I'm not relying on the probability. I'm looking at the plausibility. If, as I mentioned earlier, if we can't even get 60 nucleotides to bind, how is it a remotely, and this is in a controlled environment without the chaotic condition that the evolutionist claims was the cause. If they can't even get 60 and the recognized for the 400, the minimum number of proteins they're talking about for simplest form of life, equaling no less than 500,000 base pairs, having to all 100% of them be in the appropriate sequences. Before you even account for the coevolution of the expression proteins also having to be in place, which I mean is being conceded now. I mean, Carter and I forget the other guy. I mean, they published a paper on this last year. This exact premise, like, hey, we at this point we can no longer avoid the reality that they have to have quote co-evolved. And so again, if in a controlled environment we can't even get 60 to bind, you need no less than 500,000. I don't understand how the premise of the intelligent agent being required is one, not the plausible conclusion, as well as in terms of the different forms, their families and such, kingdom, phylum, class, order, genus, species, all that stuff. Why you wouldn't conclude that they were also structured specifically?
Right. In regards to the family, order, kingdom, or whatever.
First, let's address the foundational point first before you go down to taxonomy.
Okay, that's just that. All right. So again, there was a paper came out this year where they did find abiotic proteins in meteorites. So it does seem that they could form by some natural means. It yet to be understood.
I was aware of all that stuff, and I'm also aware that there's people directly questioning whether or not that protein was actually. Because I believe that meteorite you're talking about was discovered in was it Nigeria, Algeria, something like that, in 1989. And so it's been on this planet for quite some time. Fast forward to 2020 when they have found this protein, and I mean, that's a very significant period of time, and there's more than a few. Because I've read up on this before. You had mentioned this deal. There's plenty of people that are questioning the original source of said protein. Go ahead, Emo.
Right. So the evidence for it is not conclusive, but I was trying to see like if it does turn out that this protein is of abiotic origin, how do we now reconstruct our arguments to the origins of life? Do we still conclude that a designer is required? I mean, it doesn't rule out a designer. I'm not ruling out a designer, but how do we now face the question of the origins of life in terms of uh, protein synthesis? If they can form naturally, do we conclude that this is sufficient evidence that maybe this is the way proteins were formed, or maybe we still need a designer of some sort?
Well, one, I think the protein that you're referring to, I don't think I forget the exact number, but the number of amino acid linked on it, I think it was something ridiculously small, like 20 or 30. I believe the shortest known functional protein is significantly longer than that. As I'm sure you're aware, the complexity requirement for the functional protein to form goes up exponentially with each additional amino acid. But beyond that, in terms of actual functional protein, I believe, and this has been accepted, is that I believe the ratio of functional to non-functional proteins is 1 in 10 to the 74th power. And you're 74th or 84th, I forget exactly. So even if some amino acids, which we don't know if it's of the 20 that make up our life, make our life possible, could have bound together, it still does not remove it being a specific functional protein, B, being a protein of the complexity that's required for the execution of the most simplistic transcription processes, which would be required for expression of a genetic sequence. You still haven't explained how the arbitrary value assignment of the codon becomes equal to a amino acid when it is a well-recognized premise that the codons do not chemically interact with the amino acids. And then you also have to account for how this genetic code, A, formed, and B, how all of the nucleotide bases got in the correct order to then be expressed by this protein, which happens to be the one that has the capacity to express it. I mean, this goes back to the earlier point I was making, which is just because you can put a magnet, take a whole bunch of magnets and bind them to a sheet of metal and then organize all the magnets to spell a word. Cool, there was magnetism used, a physical process to create a word. Would you ever conclude that could have occurred without an intelligent agent just because natural processes were used? Go ahead, Emo.
All right. Well, the thing about the intelligent the agency itself is, well, we don't know that these things exist or could exist, so we have to treat this not as a hard-on conclusion, but a hypothesis. Just as abiogenesis is a hypothesis as to how life could have evolved or emerged, the design hypothesis must also be treated as such. So that's why I don't rule out design. I don't rule out abiogenesis in any way. As for if it's required, I don't know. It could be the case. It could be the case, but I'm not saying like it's required. Like I'm sure it's required, or that I'm sure it's abiogenesis. It's a question that is open, and we're trying to answer the question as to how these things come into being. the proposing a designer is the hypothesis, but we need now an explanation. For example, that's sometimes I try to compare it to archaeologists and ancient aliens, where they would come across a structure and they have the same conclusion that this thing may have been manufactured a certain way, design, for example. But the archaeologists would try to explain how it was done with the appropriate mechanisms he know of, or for example, human beings. But ancient aliens, they would posit to some alien race for which, again, they don't have direct evidence of it, but they're proposing that this alien race could have done so. Now, the archaeologist's explanations doesn't rule out his explanations or lack of explanations doesn't rule out the ancient alien hypothesis. And the ancient alien hypothesis doesn't, just because it supposedly explains it, but they don't really explain how it was done. But because it's posited, it doesn't mean, therefore, that it's somehow a conclusion that we should stick with, or it's a fact of some kind. So, intelligent design, I treat it as a hypothesis. It's a hypothesis as to how these things could come to being. And I always leave it open for the possibility that abiogenesis could also be the case. So that's my position in that I'm not certain.
Right, but you take the position rather strongly in other venues that evolution contradicts the premise of a theist in regards to it being direct evidence for the existence of a creator. But now you're saying that you keep an open mind to the intelligent agent being required. But I mean, so it's like you can't have your cake and eat it too, and say that the person who believes in intelligent design and a God agent being required for life, and using with biology being one of the many evidences for that agent, and then flip the script and act like it's a potentially reasonable conclusion that you are keeping an open mind to. I mean, that's the definition of hypocrisy. Hypocrisy.
Right. I don't object to intelligent design, as I said. I object to maybe theism, where people argue for a specific God when they don't have evidence to support that conclusion. Yeah, that's what I usually argue against. So the designer doesn't necessarily have to be a god of any kind. It could be of some origin that we're yet to understand. So that's my take on it. That the agency need not be a god. It could be something that is limited. For example, usually people would say that God is unlimited, or we can do any physical thing he's able to do.
If the
I don't think
if the requirement for an intelligent agent is for or the requirement for life is an intelligent agent, and per the atheist argument, the universe is not finely tuned for life, which was the starting point of this live stream, and that any other arena in the universe where, hey, there's supposedly all these other planets with the exact same required variables for life like Earth. If that is the case, if these other locations do exist, any form of life in this universe would have the exact same barriers to entry as life on our planet. So you are stuck with if the intelligent agent is required, and the exact same variables would apply in any other arena or potential arena in this universe, then you're still left with the intelligent agent being separate from the limitations of that physical life faces in order for us to exist. I mean, there's no way around that. You can do the Richard Dawkins kick the can down the road argument, but and his little flying spaghetti monster and all that, his hyperbole on that, but it doesn't remove the original source requirement. Go ahead, Emo.
Okay, so I guess you're talking about the origins of the universe and so on now. That is required. Well, obviously, the universe would be required for life to exist in it. Um, yeah. So the designer itself, again, it could just be something that generates universes, not necessarily something that is sentient or has foresight. Because if you have something that generates universes, for example, again, this is a speculation. Um, it it follows that maybe you can get a universe like this one that would allow for life, or maybe a universe that would allow for life to evolve easier on a separate section of the universe, and then could come and see life here. These are all possibilities, but again, these are all speculative possibilities. In the same way, we assume that the designer is God, for example, is equally as speculative, right? Because we have no direct evidence that a God actually exists or could exist in the way described. We have arguments to support it, but no direct evidence of any kind. So, and that brings me back to the ancient aliens. They would argue for ancient aliens. They have arguments, but they have no evidence to support the argument that they actually exist. So it's more in the realm of speculation as opposed to uh, hard conclusion. So that's what I treat intelligent design as, a more speculative hypothesis.
If you came
Uh-huh.
across a computer server in a cave inside of a chunk of rock that was discovered via different scanning methods, and you broke open the rock and the technology was inside, and your carbon dating said it was 5 million years old. Actually, let's say it was 5 billion years old. Would you conclude that there was an intelligent agent that was required in order for that to exist, even though, per your own model, there was no intelligent life at that time? How would you explain it?
Right. Well, the intelligent life that would appeal to Earth, but
No,
in regards to what
I'm talking about the technology. If you came across a computer server with a whole boatload of code on it inside of a cave, inside of a rock that was 5 billion years old, would you view that as categoric evidence that an intelligent agent was required for that computer server to have been built? Yes or no?
right. So yeah, I'm going to conclude that an intelligent designer designed it, but I'm going to have to base it based on what we know. So it'll be one maybe of biological origin as opposed to some supernatural one for which.
Okay, but per your timeline, the intelligent life didn't exist 5 billion years ago. Actually, we can't go that far back because Earth didn't exist then. So we're going to go 4 billion per your timeline. 4 billion years. So would you believe in evolution if we found a hard drive that was 4 billion years old? Emo, did we lose you?
Good evening.
All right, who's Midnight Sparkle?
Yeah, I've been around. You can ask standing. I go by Athena on YouTube. You know. So how you doing, Maddox? How's your Sunday treating you?
I can't complain too much. Having a good time. How about yours?
Uh, s- could be better. It could be better.
What's going on with you, man?
Uh, Nothing much. I was just doing my own thing, doing a little studying, and Immutable was like, "Oh, hey, Maddox is live. Oh, cool. Let's go over there, see what he's doing." And I decided to hop in because why the hell not?
Right on. Well, what do you want to talk about?
Well, hang on, what is even the topic of this thing? Fine tuning. What was the question? I guess the fine tuning debunked by evolution.
Well, this whole thing started off. I went off on a rant about a paper I came across that's considered a relatively significant one to in regards to does the fine tuning of the universe indicate evidence of a designer or multiverse, and the foundation of their argument as to why the intelligent designer was not required for the fine-tuning was, quote, the idea that cosmic fine-tuning originates in design by something like an intelligent creator fits into a long-standing Judeo-Christian tradition, where both the cosmos and biology were explained in that way. Now that biology has yielded to the theory of evolution proposed by Darwin and Wallace in the mid-19th century, the battleground has apparently moved back to the cosmos. And the foundational point that I was making was that the acceptance of, I say quote unquote acceptance of evolution does, number one, does not account for abiogenesis. Number two, is in no way, shape, form, or fashion proven. There's rapidly growing evidence. Hang on one second. Rapidly growing evidence that it is false. And then in the last several years, there's been dramatic moves to the position that neo-Darwinian theory does not remotely account for all these different things that we're observing. Yet, last year, we have academics proposing that the fine-tuning argument in favor of an intelligent agent is debunked because of the acceptance of a theory that is currently being having gigantic portions of it debunked by discoveries that are being made. And to me, that forms a very flawed hypothesis.
Well, what theory has been, let's explore this a little bit. What theory is it, was it put forth to, debunk or, to go against the fine tuning thing. And it's like, you know what I mean? Do you know what theory they're talking about? Or is just like a vague theory that has no name? Like what does it entail?
You are familiar with the fine tuning argument, right?
Yes, I'm familiar with the fine tuning argument, but you said there was a theory against the. If I misheard you correctly, you said there was a theory, there was a theory, that was posited against fine tuning, which was in the process of being debunked. I asked you what that theory is. It has a name, doesn't it? Or are you talking about string theory? Like what name?
No. The point I was making is that the paper I'm referring to is doing an analysis of the fine-tuning in favor of a intelligent agent or a being required, or
by the way, Immutable Destiny is backstage. I don't know if you want to let him. I don't know if you want to keep this 2-on-2 or 1-on-1 or. There we go.
What's going on?
What's up, Immutable?
Not too much. How's your Sunday going?
That's not too bad.
Nice.
Well, it's going fabulous for me.
How's it going fabulous? A minute ago, you said you weren't having a good one, man. You're changing positions pretty quickly.
No, I said.
We'll see.
Calling you out, man. Calling you out on some of that BS, bro.
Oh, you're talking to Immutable. Yeah, mine was fine. His is, I don't know. But
are you guys talking about abiogenesis, or what's the topic?
Well, yeah, I actually wanted to address that. There were a few things I wanted to address, but if you want to go, since you're more versed in this topic, you can have the floor.
I think he's talking.
That's your cue, Immutable.
Yeah, no, and I'm fine if Midnight participates. I'm just kind of curious what Maddox's point was. It's interesting to hear him talk occasionally.
Bottom line, evolution doesn't account for abiogenesis. Therefore, evolution is wrong, I think.
No, dude, did you listen to a word I just said? because I literally outlined why I was having this entire discussion, which was that when you the fine-tuning argument is being supposedly the intelligent agent component of the fine-tuning argument versus it being the result of a multiverse, string theory, all those different components. The intelligent agent side of the argument is being dismissed by in the terms of the paper I'm referring to, that it's dismissed because it's only reliant on the evidence in the cosmos versus biology, because Darwinism has been accepted and therefore debunks the need for a intelligent agent in order for life to exist. And the entire point that I'm making is that.
By the way, Speed of Sound wants to link to the paper, and also, also.
Hey, Midnight.
Yes?
If you want to be on here, this is not a. Hey, let's relay Speed of Sound stuff. I see him.
Fair enough. I just wanted to point that out. Because he wanted the paper. My bad.
Anyway, so I'm gonna finish the whole point here. Is that I was almost done with the sentence. The point being that if people are going to just dismiss a gigantic portion of the overall macro fine-tuning argument because evolution supposedly explains life, when it is freely admitted by origin of life researchers that it does not, and then even all the way up to you extrapolate out to even following the evolutionary model, there's huge portions of it that don't explain vast portions of life in that manner as well. So to say that we can dismiss a gigantic portion of an argument because of something that is disputed and also does not account for the origin of life question is a very weird position to be taking. And yet it is the exact same position that is taken by so many atheist activists in terms of evidence for a creator. Okay, now I'm done.
Okay, I've never heard too many cosmologists use the word Darwinism or things like that. I'd be interested to see the paper. But like, do you have any contentions on abiogenesis specifically, or any of the above topics you just named? And it'd be nice to narrow in on something.
Okay, so you guys aren't comprehending the overarching point that's being made?
No, I think you're trying to say that there's reason to be suspicious of the current theories due to holes that haven't yet been solved, and it might be reasonable to posit an intelligent agent to explain those gaps.
No.
That's what I got from it. Maybe that wasn't your point.
Okay. You are aware of the fine-tuning argument, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. The paper, which I'm pulling up a link for right now, I'll post here in a second, that I'm referring to, when they get to the portion of why the intelligent agent is not the reasonable conclusion, is that because or a foundational component of why they say it's not is because that since biology is explained by Darwin, therefore you do not have to account for life being the result of an intelligent agent requirement. Therefore, the only thing that has to be accounted for is the fine-tuning of the universe, not the variables that are required for life. So you're cutting out literally 50% of the overall argument. You guys follow me now?
Maybe it's just the way you're phrasing it. I'd have to read it and mull it over to make sense of that. I'm pretty sure that's logical. It's just, for me, reading sometimes better helps take a grasp of what they're saying. But I think I get what you're saying.
Okay, so I've run my mouth. There's two of y'all.
Okay, I mean, do you want to talk about evolution or abiogenesis, or what's
I mean, you told me to be quiet.
You guys
So.
wanted to come onto my stream. What do y'all want to talk about? I've been running my mouth for an hour.
I'm not the one that denies evolution. I'm not the one that is having a fit over abiogenesis. I mean, I don't mind what topics you want to discuss or think that I'm wrong about.
Well, I guess one thing I did want to say is that why couldn't this intelligent agent use abiogenesis and thus evolution as well? Like why does it have to be one and the other? Like, if this intelligent agent exists, he obviously set in motion the processes that eventually led to life being synthesized on Earth, and 3.8 billion years later, or what was I think 4.2? The number keeps updating because they find new information. Why couldn't it have been that? Like, that's my view anyway. If this intelligent agent exists, he set up the process for abiogenesis to exist, and thus evolution.
Okay, so the foundational point is that, in context of life, is that abiogenesis is not possible without the intelligent agent. That's the position I'm taking. And
okay, I'm not sure
if life in any form requires an intelligent agent, and the fine-tuning requirements based on the extraordinarily improbability also would indicate the requirement of an intelligent agent. It is not unreasonable to conclude that the intelligent agent exists, and is directly contradictory to the atheist worldview, which is A, no intelligent agent is required for life to exist, and B, that there is no intelligent agent required for the universe to exist. So I mean, it's rather glaringly obvious dichotomy.
So I disagree on quite a few points. I'm not sure necessarily that life requires an intelligent designer to have come into being. And I'm not sure that it sounded like you were saying that the probability of something occurring is related to that thing actually being able to come into existence.
Actually, I was referring to the improbability in the context of the recognized improbability of something, i.e. the universe, and the fine-tuning components existing without the intelligent agent. That's not me making up the extreme improbability. It's literally considered the most improbable thing that could possibly happen, is the fine-tuning variables. In context of abiogenesis and life, yes, it is extraordinarily improbable to the degree of, in any other context, it would be considered zero. Yet people still try to postulate that it could happen, even though, again, in any other context, it would be considered zero. The point I'm making is that it is neither the logical nor the plausible conclusion when you look at the known requirements for the simplest form of life, requiring simultaneous execution of different components. It's not even a rational conclusion.
I think the issue with trying to argue it strictly from a probabilistic standpoint is that.
Did you not listen to a word I said, which was I'm not arguing from a probabilistic perspective? Did you listen to a word I said?
Yeah, it sounded like you were using arguments that other people have come up with and that you're endorsing them.
Okay, I literally started with the preface of, I am not referring to the probability. I'm talking about the plausibility and the rationality of when you look at all of the components that require, and I extrapolate on this, it require prescriptive, predefined information in order to be executed. There is no other context in which the variables could exist no matter what the probability numbers say. There's no other context in which those variables would be considered plausible to come into existence without the intelligent agent, except in the context of abiogenesis, which is a foundational talking point of the atheist. Go ahead. Hope I'm clear now.
I'm not sure what exactly makes abiogenesis impossible or extremely unlikely. I've read several papers that argue each side of it, and they both seem to make valid points regarding how specific the process must be. But to the majority of papers I've read, I haven't heard it state outright that it's impossible.
Okay, so the entire point that I made was in any other context, it would be considered impossible. However, in this context, in a desperate attempt to avoid the obvious conclusion of the intelligent agent being required, therefore destroying the entire, if not all, a gigantic percentage of the atheist argument and the evolutionary argument. Okay. Of course they're avoiding it. That's the entire point I'm making, is that in any other context, it would be considered impossible.
Oh, okay. Is it possible that biological systems are not comparable to other types of systems that exist? That the reason people are saying that is this is a categorical error?
So the biocomputational things that we are creating right now that are using biological systems and components, do you think it is a remotely plausible conclusion that the circuitry that we are leveraging to create our own component that has a biological foundation but a human designed output, are you suggesting that it is plausible to conclude that that function could come into existence without the intelligent agent that is designing it with a end goal in mind?
No, I'm not saying that.
Okay, so it follows the exact same processes, and the exact same thing is occurring in biology, just with a different output. Yet the one that we're creating, which uses the exact same components, couldn't come into existence without the intelligent agent, but the ones that are exponentially more advanced and complex that we observe in biology could. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and there's a very strict reason for that. The reason being is whenever I observe some phenomenon and I try to examine, for instance, is this thing well, first of all, regard the intelligent aspect of this. Was something designed? What are characteristics of an object that I can point to such that it would lend credence to this notion of being designed? Are there processes which occur naturally that can form this process and that exclude that don't need the assumption of an intelligent agent to build it? Things like softwares that, like software programs and things that computer scientists do are processes we've only observed coming from, at least to my knowledge, from people who know how to do that type of thing. With biological systems, on the other hand, we understand the basis and the foundation for how these structures can form based on chemical reactivity.
So you are saying that because a DNA computer that we have built that uses the exact same process that we observe in biological systems, you are suggesting, again, that the quote-unquote naturally occurring computational ability in organisms could come into existence without the requirements you just assigned to the ones that are created by humans in computers, which are also being executed in biological computers that we're creating, and while simultaneously ignoring the fact that the that cybernetics and computer science is actually directly inspired by the computational points that I'm making in biology. I mean, everything we're doing in computer science is directly as a result of observations from biology, but we agree that the ones that we're creating couldn't have come into existence without an intelligent agent, while simultaneously arguing that the ones that we're trying to copy did.
That's what I'm arguing.
Okay, and how do you explain that? How do you explain prescriptive information?
I don't think it's prescriptive. If you're like,
you don't think that a formal outcome that is derived from a specific set of instructions is prescriptive?
I don't think that analogy holds in the case of the genome.
Oh, I think it absolutely holds in this case of the genome. Please do tell how you think it is not.
Can you give an example where you think that there's direct prescriptive information in the genome to create one specific product?
Didn't you tell me that you studied biochemistry?
Yeah.
And you don't know the answer to that question?
I'm just wanting you to give an example.
What is translational pausing?
Can you go through my example first, and then I'll answer yours? That seems kind of fair.
How about you make an argument?
I am making an argument. You asked me about, do I think certain things can occur?
So your argument is that there is no prescriptive information in the genome. Is that correct?
No, I said that the analogy you're trying to use doesn't necessarily hold. That you were arguing, for instance.
Hang on. I'll answer you. I'll give you an example in a second. First, are you stating that the central dogma of biology does not state that a specific sequence equals a specific outcome?
To my knowledge, that's not what that's not what the central dogma states.
But it's literally one gene, one protein. That's literally the central dogma.
Let me look it up. I could be wrong, and if that's the case, I'm happy to concede the point, but let's look it up. Central dogma of biology. Let's see. Overview, the central dogma of biology. The central dogma of molecular biology describes the two-step process, transcription and translation, by which the information in genes flows to proteins, DNA, RNA to protein. So it says nothing particularly about one gene, one product.
Okay, the original central dogma that was developed by Francis Crick. That was exactly what it was. Now it's expanded as we've discovered that the same gene sequence, if modified in a specific way, a specific prescriptive way, can have a modified outcome. But that does not mean that there is not that both one gene, one outcome is not also correct. You can also have one gene modification, new outcome. However, it requires a prescriptive order of the codons in order for that to occur, correct?
To some extent. I mean, typically, variation of the third codon will result in the same protein just by a matter of statistical analysis.
Right, but this goes back to translational pausing and what they've discovered about that Wobble Effect that you're referring to, and how that third position actually has relevance to the actual physical structure of the and stability of the protein outcome.
Right,
and it is a secondary syntax inside of the primary syntax, which modifies the expression variation of inside the ribosome. So,
right. So
you're having a very prescriptive. So you have both the foundational code of codon A equals amino acid B, or equals amino acid A, as well as a timing variable that is conditioned inside of the overall syntax into a subsyntax.
Right.
So I'm not really following how you can suggest that that is not expressly prescriptive information.
the reason I'm saying it's not expressly prescriptive is the fact that if you take two genes that are identical and you choose to mutate the triplet, one of the triplets in the one of the last bases in a triplet, chances are very high that this mutation will result with the same codon assignment for the same amino acid. Although, and usually it'll be transcribed, although there are documented cases where this does not occur due to tRNA availability, issues with binding with the tRNA and the ribosome and things like that.
Yeah,
So, yes,
there's
there
error correction functions. Absolutely.
Right. So there are instances where, yes, certain genes are highly specific in terms of what tRNAs are required. I'd be interested in seeing a database compiling what particular species-specific tRNAs are used or are preserved within humans as compared to, say, insects or something like that.
I'm not really sure how this is any relevance to whether or not there is a prescriptive information requirement, which you said there isn't.
Okay, so if
So
you're
is
saying
there or is there not a prescriptive information requirement for the outcomes that you're referring to?
So the question I'm going to ask kind of helps lead us there, which is that when you say something is prescriptive, right, you're saying that this particular assignment of characters, whatever they happen to represent, is at least is a necessary and sufficient requirement for that thing to form. And is that the logical structure you're using?
Say that again.
So when you're saying that the genetic code is prescriptive in its information, right? So whatever string of nucleotides is stringed together, what's being meant by necessary, at least what I'm interpreting, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that this string of nucleotides is necessary and sufficient for the formation of its final product.
It's necessary. It's not in order to have the end outcome. It is not sufficient by itself. No.
Okay. In that case, then, assuming that ribosomal pausing doesn't occur to a vast majority of codon substitutions, how would that then be necessary?
I'm not following your point. You're attempting to dodge whether or not there is prescriptive information required, and I gave you two different examples of both of which I'm assuming you're agreeing that, because you did, that there are absolutely observed instances where it is relevant, number one. So yes. The prescriptive element is there. And B, are you suggesting that the nucleotide bases must be in a specific triplet in order for the ribosome to read it as a specific amino acid?
So what I'm saying is that if you consider
does the codon triplets have to be exactly correct in order for it to equal an amino acid? Yes or no?
No. There can be variation within the third base pair of a codon triplet and still result within the same amino acid.
Okay. I'm not going to waste time on the Wobble Effect because there's all sorts of things they're discovering about that. It actually does have much more bearing.
Right. I know what the Wobble Effect is.
What I'm trying to if the third position on every single codon was incorrect, would a protein synthesize? Yes or no?
Chances are no.
Okay. So in the context of basic information theory, if you have a code base, you account, and it's in a compact form, you account for error correction. And you have that's like a fundamental basic of information theory. And in every piece of information transfer technology that we have, we account for errors that can be corrected on the fly. And
Right.
we have that exact same function in both transcription as well as translation. And so I'm not really following you in the context of, oh, cool, in rare instances, we can have a wobble effect with the third one if the other two are correct. And however, that doesn't apply in many very, very specific ones. And then we also have a recognized, doesn't necessarily apply in every single instance, but we know beyond doubt that it does apply in many, in terms of the translational pausing variable of the prescriptive information that is housed within the genetic code and the primary and the subset syntax. So again, back to the original point is, are you suggesting that all of that does not equal the requirement of prescriptive information in order for something such as protein synthesis to occur, especially when you look at it from the error correction functions that are in existence to cause the expression of the original intent of the original meaning of the codon?
I kind of heard what you said. Could you repeat it again, but in a more compact way?
I just made a comprehensive argument, and I'm guessing your knowledge is limited to not understand the point I'm making.
No, it's that.
So if A equals B, and if you have one of the legs of your A cut off, are you still going to be able to recognize that B equals A?
No, because there's a set of characteristics that define A. In particular, I would assume.
No. You're missing the point, buddy. In the context of reading of information, prescriptive information that has meaning and has semantics.
Mm-hmm.
If A equals B, right, from a coding perspective, and I send you a picture of an A, but it's slightly misbalanced, right? So the leg on the left side of the letter A is slightly longer than B, or than the other side. Are you still going to recognize that A that I sent you still equals B?
Yes.
Okay. In image processing and scanning that we're doing with AI, are we being able to analyze things based on, even if something's blurry, we're still being able to recognize what something is up to a certain extent?
Sure. I mean, it depends on relative distortion, but yeah, sure.
Right, that's my point. It's all about the relative distortion. So if you have half the picture is, or 3/4 of the picture is completely clear, and the other quarter is blurry, but behind you, you see in the non-blurry part, you see the Eiffel Tower, you're going to immediately recognize that the person or the picture was taken in Paris, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So because you're using, in your mind, in this context, you're using error correction. Well, the same logic applies in information theory in terms of transmission and translation of data. Is you can account for errors. And there's literal papers on the whole syntax redundancy aspect being an element that creates the robustness of the genetic code and its prescriptive capabilities. So this goes back to the original question I keep asking, which is, if prescriptive information is required for the outcome of an information transfer, in what other context, without pre-programmed and pre-functional computer technologies, for example, that have the ability to know what the semantics are, in what other context would that ever occur without an intelligent agent?
I would say none.
Okay, so the fundamental basics of abiogenesis require something that you just admitted in any other context could not exist without an intelligent agent. Yet you, I think, are still holding that the intelligent agent was not required.
So it's, let me put it this way. It's possible, of course, that there's an intelligent agent that's involved in this process. From what I've read, from what I've heard in argumentation, I don't see a reason to accept that claim. But the other thing is that I don't see that as being a parsimonious explanation in terms of trying to construct a scientific theory.
I'm still not following how you think that makes it the less likely proposition that the intelligent agent was required, when in any other context we know that they would be a 100% required variable.
I didn't say anything about less likely. I don't know.
I said required. I said the required agent.
Okay, how? It could be required.
Why would that not? Why would that not be the logical foundational position to assert? Not that, hey, we can't figure out a different way, like how things work and what the functions are and all that kind of stuff. Because that's one of those. I'm not saying you're making this, but it's one of the standard stupid ass atheist or talking points I hear of. Oh, if you believe in a intelligent agent, that's going to just stop any curiosity into how things work, which is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. But I'm talking about from a foundational perspective of, if you conclude that the existence of something without an intelligent agent is impossible, that doesn't mean that you don't want to figure out how it works and why you wouldn't want to follow and dive into the intricacies of arguably the most complicated thing that we could possibly study, and of which we freely admit we know hardly anything. And the point I'm making is, if it has all indications of being impossible without the intelligent agent, based on the extraordinarily simplistic understanding we have of it, but the freely admitted overarching components that make it even more unlikely that we're starting to discover on a daily basis, why would you even continue to try and postulate that the goalpost that's getting further and further away from you is the more and more likely outcome, rather than the one that is literally in front of you is not the logical starting point?
So the best way I have to make a different statement before I respond to that, which is how we were talking before about trying to determine if something is intelligently designed or if it can arise by a natural process. Typically, the only reason, well, not the only reason, but the best reason we can conclude something like that happening is for the reason that, one, which is the point you're making, that these things are concordant with an intelligent designer forming them, but also one of the things that we search for before looking for an intelligent designer is the prospect of, okay, there is an explanation where an intelligent designer can use these things. That raises other questions metaphysically about how those things occur. But you can also ask the question, okay, do there exist mechanisms that don't require this intelligent designer as a process? That the process still occurs without the need of this intelligent agent intervening on its behalf? If the answer is yes, it seems that the proposition which takes the least assumptions is the one which is more likely to be true.
Right. And your supposition that the intelligent designer agent position has exponentially less assumptions than the atheist abiogenesis argument. I
don't know necessarily. Okay.
In the context of the intelligent agent, the only variable is the intelligent agent.
I would disagree.
I'm talking about in being able to execute the physical processes that are required. In the atheist worldview, every single one of the components that is required and recognized to be required has to have the capacity to organize itself undirected with no external agent causing it other than purely the natural process. That is, I mean, that's an unavoidable fact. You can't work around that one. So,
Yeah, okay. But,
so
okay,
all of the improbabilities that you were attempting, I wasn't necessarily wanting to go down, but then you have to factor in the recognized improbabilities of all of those known variables coming into play without the intelligent agent. With the intelligent agent, it's 100% plausible. Hey, if I know how, I mean, it would be like saying that, you have a piece of steel. Is the probability of that piece of steel without an intelligent agent, actually steel would be man-made, so let's go with iron. A piece of iron turning itself into a sword blade without the intelligent agent, the probability of that is freaking zero. With the intelligent agent,
right,
there's zero problem with that occurring. The same thing applies to coding.
Okay,
there is
so
zero chance that the Morse code using light could ever exist without an intelligent agent. There's zero probability that
right, okay,
any kind of programming that has logic gates and if then else functions, there is zero probability that that could come into existence. Given even with an infinite amount of time and an infinite number of universes, there is zero probability that would ever come into existence without an intelligent agent. So when you're looking at the exact same variables being required for life to exist, this is why I say the probability with the intelligent agent is 100%. There's zero problem.
So, okay.
If you want to go the other route, you have to account for the stunning level of improbability, which in any other context would be considered zero. Go ahead.
Okay, so this might be a discussion that needs to take place later because I'm going to have to take care of some other things around the house. So I'd love to continue this at some point. I've got maybe 30 minutes left. But so when we're talking about abiogenesis as opposed to, say, the process of creation, one point that should be considered, right, is the substrate of what's being used. So in the case of prebiotic chemistry or abiogenesis, whatever you want to call it, we're using organic and inorganic compounds to react and form more complex structures. And these are going to hypothetically be able to have the propensity and capacity to form life. So based upon molecular biology, based upon how on a molecular framework we operate, it follows, I mean, just purely logically, that chemical reactions have to be able to occur for some final process which requires it to succeed, right?
Yeah.
So the point with that is when we're considering abiogenesis and we're surveying the fact that, okay, there's an ass load of environments that exist here. Which of these are plausible? Which of these are going to be the most favorable for the formation of glycose sugars or amino acids or whatever the case may be? There has to be some means in which for that process to be able to occur in a mechanistic sense and in the sense of, and in the physical sense of actual thermodynamics. So
I've conceded this point already many times that
right. Okay.
That does not require the example. Right. The example I used earlier was the 2016 nano car race.
Right.
When the teams that designed those nano cars, all of that was the result of natural chemical processes.
Yes.
Being organized in a specific format to reach a desired outcome.
Right.
Is there any context, regardless of the fact that, holy crap, it's possible to do this? Well, no kidding. Is there any context in which you would conclude that these proton-powered nano cars could come into existence without those intelligent agents.
No, and the reason for that is the processes which are used, which are required to form these nanostructures, are very rare to naturally occur on their own. That is the reason, which I can conclude, okay, probably you won't see protein nanocars forming just out of the blue.
Okay, so this goes back to the aspect of the chemical reactions that you're referring to that occur inside of nature. It's a widely accepted premise that without the control variables that are executed through enzymes, other proteins, et cetera, these chemical reactions that we're observing would also not be naturally occurring. That's a well accepted premise that would
I'd have
not
to
be the
see
outcome.
where you're taking. Okay, so I'm not denying you. I'm saying that I would have to see the citation for that source. I've read several.
That's like basic. That's like basic biology and biochemistry 101. That these things are not natural. They are controlled and accelerated, decelerated, and without all of these variables working in unison, this outcome would not occur. I mean, that's a fundamentally accepted premise in every aspect of abiogenesis, and B, in terms of molecular biology and biochemistry now. I mean, that's well recognized that this is. I mean, these are half the conundrums of what they're trying to figure out, and it's also a huge reason why us trying to copy and modify and everything else is so difficult, because you have to have all the variables assigned prior to being able to execute your desired end outcome. I don't understand how complicated that is. I mean, that's some basic stuff right there, man.
Right. I'm curious what paper specifically is placing restrictions or flat out saying that some reaction needed to form a nucleotide or whatever won't occur or is simply infeasible. So you're saying it's well known. It's perhaps the case that I don't know, that I'm unfamiliar with the literature you're referencing.
Okay, this is a plethora of stuff, man. You need to go do some some pretty basic research on the effects of enzymes. I mean, okay, does a enzyme accelerate or decelerate a naturally occurring process? Yeah, I mean, from an exponential perspective, yes or no?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so the process that it is accelerating would not be naturally occurring without this protein or this enzyme also being in place, correct?
No, that doesn't follow.
The accelerated or decelerated natural chemical reaction would occur without the enzyme? Yes.
And the reason for that is because of the way enzymes actually work.
No. The enzyme isn't in play. We've removed the enzyme from the equation.
Right.
The speed of the reaction between two other things occur at the normal half-life or the normal timing, or without the enzyme, would it accelerate or decelerate by itself?
It can be accelerated without the enzyme, to answer your question.
Does it require an additional variable?
It requires the same basic ideas of how enzymes work, but does
it require an additional? Okay, now the new cause. Okay, it's not the enzyme. There may be an additional cause that can do it, but is there an additional variable that must be inserted to change what is the natural process?
No.
Okay.
So
you tell, because I have never seen it. It could be additional heat. It could be cold. There's a variety of things that can modify an outcome. If you remove those from the equation, it's not going to modify. It's going to follow whatever the quote unquote natural process is.
Right. Okay. if you warrant the assumption that the temperature reaction is occurring and is significant, it's significantly cold, so that there aren't much molecular collisions, and that you can have complexations form within liquids and things like that, it is possible.
But there's a new variable, right?
Well, even
in this context, the new variable is it's very cold, correct?
Right.
Okay,
But even
so
in the
it's not, so it's not a natural process.
Hold on.
It requires an additional variable.
Maddox. Okay. The reason it isn't an additional variable is because, as you should know, as you well should know, enzymes also depend on temperature. If the internal temperature where an enzyme is housed increases significantly, that enzyme is going to begin to that protein and its scaffolding is going to begin to unravel.
Right.
And if there's too much heat being given off, then the protein will completely disassemble.
Right.
That is why enzymes naturally occur at room temperature. They occur in environments that are conducive to proteins being able to form, and also conducive for them to stay relatively stable. So,
okay, I'm not sure. I understand all that.
Okay, but in the case of what we're talking about involving chemical reaction, it's not different. The temperature is still a relevant factor, but in the case of what reactions are needed to form, what reactions or what complexations are needed to move product A to product or reactant A to product B, what's changing is the magnitude of the temperature.
Okay, I'm still not following how this has any relevance to whether or not, in the context of what is required for life,
so with an enzyme,
there's a plethora of core functions in biological systems that would you have an enzyme A that accelerates the natural process of 6,000%,
right,
in order to execute, and that is a fundamental requirement for outcome B to occur.
It isn't.
And the outcome of, if the outcome, if the XYZ that is attempting to be executed took 6,000 times, was 6,000 times slower, it has no bearing. But it's but in this context, what's being accelerated is a fundamental component of life. So you are now
not okay.
You have to have the functional information that must exist in order to execute in order to create the enzyme, which is then needed to execute the creation of a additional protein.
So the error I'm seeing with this argument is that the information needed for the reaction to occur is contained within the enzyme, but it isn't reliant upon the enzyme inherently.
What was required for the enzyme to exist?
What requires for the enzyme to exist is for the amino acids which compose it to exist.
Okay.
And for the functional domain to be
what is required for those amino acids to be organized in the specific sequence which results in this amino acid or this enzyme?
Typically it requires a room temperature heat and a relatively neutral pH environment.
What was required in order for the amino acids to be organized in the appropriate sequence in order to have the outcome of the enzyme?
In the case of modern proteins, ribozymes typically. Or ribosomes.
You're clearly attempting to dodge because you know where I'm going with all this.
Maddox,
you go back to the prescriptive information that is the ultimate source origin that is required in order for all these other processes that you're referring to exist in a controlled manner.
Okay, so let's go back to the point which was actually somewhat interesting, which is what exactly when an enzyme acts on a reactant to form a product, what is the information contained within that enzyme that is allowing that reaction to be accelerated?
Go ahead and tell me.
No, I'm curious as to what you think.
Go ahead, because you're dodging all of my points on the
No, I'm
root
not dodging your
requirement
point.
for that
I
information to even exist. So go ahead. You explain to me.
No, I'm not.
I'm not denying that there's
I'm not
information
dodging.
inside of that enzyme. That's not the point. I'm talking about the root requirements for what you're now talking about. You're wanting to look at some 6 steps down the road while ignoring the source requirement for the first 5 steps to reach step 6.
No. Maddox, what I'm asking about is the step 0. I'm asking fundamentally on a basis of chemical reaction. What exactly is the enzyme doing that is providing the reactants the conversion rate to be accelerated?
I really don't understand. Go ahead and explain it to all of us.
Typically, with most enzymes, what's occurring is the relaxation of specific functional groups in a parent molecule so that the reaction is able to occur more rapidly.
Okay.
That's significant because of the fact that some, for very reasons I really can't get into, certain functional groups organically don't want to react in a specific way that you're trying to get it to in biological systems. So occasionally, biological systems have to be very, I use the word clever loosely, have to be very clever about how the chemical conversion takes place. So the point of this is that what is allowing the mediation for this conversion rate to be accelerated are the amino acids that reside within the active site. Now, other regions of the protein serve other roles for a cell, but fundamentally, if we're talking about what is responsible in terms of reactant A going to product B mediated by an enzyme, that is what's occurring.
You still haven't explained where the prescriptive information requirement that ultimately leads to this process that you're referring to originated from. Again, as I said earlier, cool. We have a computer. We have a internal combustion engine that uses gasoline to create the heat and the force to move a piston. How the piston moves has zero to do with, or not zero, but it doesn't explain how the gas got in the gas tank in the first place, and the starter and the ignition switch and the battery and all the other components that led to the internal combustion process that is occurring. And that is what you are talking about here in terms of how an enzyme interacts and accelerates or decelerates a process. I mean, that you're either avoiding or you're missing the entire point.
No. So to answer your question in the most simple way I know how to, the prescriptive information for some reaction to be complete and form its product is contained within spatial information and also thermodynamic and kinetic information regarding that molecule.
How did it get in the appropriate structure? And how did the mechanisms which can react to and recognize the points that you're making, how did they come into the hyper-specific structure in which they must be in order to exist?
That, like I was saying about 30 minutes ago, that the actual details of abiogenesis, and they're still being discovered, so it's by no means a complete topic.
Hang on a second, I'll be right back.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Right. So, like I was saying 30 minutes ago, I can't at the moment go into the details of certain reactions that seem to be necessary to occur to allow formation of bioprecursors, which will eventually form biomolecules. I can send you papers that are very comprehensive in analyzing these questions, particularly regarding what are very basic chemical structures that can form and do form within these prebiotic experiments and have been observed in nature, and also what are the parameters necessary, be it temperature, any spectator ions, whatever, for that reaction to occur. But at the moment, I can't.
Does any of what you're referring to? Because I've read plenty of that stuff, and the hypotheses of how if all of these things happen in this specific manner, then we might be able to explain a formation of this molecule. It does not, however, explain things such as the syntax requirement of the codons to equal amino acid, and your little tangent about the dropping different chemistry jargon does not avoid the known recognized conundrum that there is no chemical interaction between the codon and the amino acid. I mean, we know this beyond doubt. So this goes back to the syntax formation that of the code, which per studies is optimal and literally the best one out of a million that the study I'm referring to looked at. You have a code with a syntax which derives prescriptive information, which then executes in a translation process which is not solely dependent on direct chemical recognition between amino acid A and codon A, which then results in a functional protein, and that somehow all of that got into the direct sequence back over in the gene that is required.
Right.
None of the stuff that the rabbit holes you went down remotely come close to explaining what everything I just said there. And
nor was it attempting to, because the initial point.
The point I'm making is, why in the heck did you just waste all the time on that little tangent if there is no relevance to the ultimate question that we're actually discussing, which is, what are the elements that, yes, they leverage natural processes, but contain elements that it is not a remotely plausible conclusion could occur without an intelligent agent in any other context, because the medium with which the information is contained has zero relevancy to the source. And the reason I say that is we have reprogrammed things to read different syntax. We have used DNA to store pictures, and we're literally trying to turn it into an incredibly efficient storage mechanism. And humans are actively looking for ways to store data into this process. I would wager, just because we've stored an image inside of DNA, nobody would ever conclude that could occur, nor the syntax that was used to store it could ever occur without an intelligent agent. We are talking about the exact same thing, yet you and many others are somehow trying to figure out a way, something that we, in the exact same medium, would never conclude could be possibly utilized by us to create a similar mechanism. without the intelligent agent. However, it could occur in order for life to exist, which is way more complicated than what we're trying to do.
Right. And so first of all, to the first point you mentioned, the reason we entered down that rabbit trail was because you made the claim that there are certain reactions that are more or less restricted and cannot form.
I never said they couldn't form. I said they wouldn't form without the enzyme.
Right. And
they would not occur at the speed, whether it's higher or lower, right? They wouldn't occur in the process that we observe occurring. They wouldn't happen without the enzyme. And if the reaction, which they are accelerating, decelerating, et cetera, didn't occur, then whatever the end outcome that it was influencing, it or many others were influencing to result in an end outcome would not occur. And if that end outcome did not occur, then life would fail. And the entire point I'm making in terms of why it's more logical to conclude and rational and plausible that not only, in addition to being more probable, that the intelligent agent was required in the beginning was that we know through all observation that without these plethora of variables working in synchronicity and having simultaneous existence, the fundamental basics of a cell could not work, period.
Right. And so okay. So the most basic way to address that type of argument is one, to address the point of, okay, here's the ingredients list that we need to form a cell. We need lipids, we need proteins, and we need nucleotides. Can those things form without proteins, and can they form by means of natural processes? The overwhelming conclusion from the data I've read is yes. However, it appears to be very mediated.
Do you actually think that lipid bilayers have occurred through natural process?
Yes.
Through their uncontrolled process?
Yes.
We've created extraordinarily simplistic single lipids. We have not created through undirected process. No,
the research
we have not created the equivalent of the lipids in terms of the lipid bilayers that surround a cell. We have not recreated that. Period.
Okay, so you were asking about lipid bilayer systems being formed in natural environments. The answer to that question is yes, they can form naturally. There are experiments which demonstrate that. To the complexity that is currently present within eukaryotic cells, no, and that's not what's trying to be proved. Because your initial claim was that we cannot form lipid bilayers.
Okay, so actually my original claim was that life cannot exist without, and again, this is accepted, no less than 400 proteins and 500,000 base pair genome. And
if I can ask, where are you getting that number from?
Dude, go Google it. That is, I've read this multiple locations.
Maddox, I can Google.
The point I'm making is,
Maddox, I wasn't done.
Okay, let's lower the number. Let's say it's 100.
Maddox, the number doesn't concern me. It's where you're getting the number from.
Go and Google it.
Can you please provide a source?
Anyway, as I've said, go Google it. No, I'll look through the billion papers that I have and go find it. I'm not doing it right now while I'm discussing this.
Maddox.
You can get
there are 2 times separately in this conversation where you.
Okay, so
Maddox, I wasn't done.
Anyway,
there are 2 times.
All right. So anyway, Immutable is taking the obvious tactic when he's being called out on his BS attempt to explain the complexities that are being pointed out, and the improbabilities and the implausibilities of the position that he's taking, being, give me a source. Well, dude, this is a well-accepted premise. I'm not going to go search through the 100+ papers that I've got to go find this exact thing on the fly. It's not how I operate. I don't operate at your leisure. I say go Google it. It's a findable premise. The point I am ultimately making, let's say it's only 100 different proteins are required. And let's say it's only 100,000 base pair genome. Without the proteins and the lipid bilayers and the appropriate sequences all existing in simultaneous function, the outcome of life is accepted to be, it's not even remotely a plausible position to take. And to argue, oh, one of these might be able to form by itself to explain the simultaneous requirement, not only in time, but also in geographic space, to somehow account for the extraordinarily, just mind-bendingly ridiculous conclusion that this can happen through undirected process being the more reasonable conclusion, the more likely conclusion, than something that in the lab we can't recreate, even if you have all of the pre-existing parts already accounted for. It's nuts.
Well, thank you for cutting me off. The point I was trying to make with that was, number one, you provided two claims that have not been sourced. And the reason that's important is, number one.
And by the way, just a second, before you continue, if you want to get kicked off again, you can shut up. This is my channel. And if I tell you, if I mute you, that means you stop talking.
Maddox.
Welcome back, Emo. What's going on, buddy? Emo, you want to get back on? Well, if Emo says he wants to start talking, you can take yourself off mute, buddy.
Oh, yeah.
What's
Sorry
up,
about that. I was actually listening backstage, actually.
Welcome back, man.
Yeah, I was sorry about that. I was kind of listening via Bluetooth, so I was backstage.
Oh, no worries.
Well, I was following your guys' argument a bit, but not too versed in prebiotic chemistry, so I'm not going to even attempt to argue there. I basically deal with botany. You had a question though, where you asked if I was to come across a processor in like a 4 billion year old rock, and we dated it to be such. If I would conclude if it was designed and so on. I think that was the question. Am I getting it right?
Yeah. If we came across a computer server, not only the hardware but also software in something, and every indication was it was existed prior to life, would we conclude that there must have been an intelligent agent that, or at least up to that point, we believe there was no other intelligent agent? Then you find this, would it be the rational conclusion as evidence that there must have been an intelligent agent that was required for it to exist?
Right. So yes, we would have to investigate what could have caused such a thing to happen, and what agency we would, what agency we'd apply to it. For example, we would have to get the appropriate designer. We wouldn't propose that it was some kind of microbial organism, or maybe an organism with a brain, but it doesn't have the appropriate limbs and so on to construct it. So most likely we would propose that it would be some kind of biological agency with, limbs and so on, is able to manipulate matter in that sense.
Would we that you're jumping to an additional point? Would the ultimate root require intelligence?
Right. After we investigated, yeah, sure, we'd have to conclude it was designed. If after investigation we see that, okay, this thing there is no natural process by which it can happen on its own, or it requires some additional processes by some kind of agency. They usually we would conclude it's a natural agency would be required to construct it. But I did have a question though. For example, let's say we go to like an alien planet, a planet outside of our solar system, and we come across some self-replicators, but they're robots, right? And they were built by an alien race, but all evidence of that alien race were gone, was lost. So all we have is those self-replicators doing what they do. Upon seeing those things, even though you would conclude design, what type of designer would you posit could have created those self-replicators?
I mean, it would require an intelligent agent. There's no the point I'm making is that yes, there's the instant intuitive and rational conclusion is that there was an intelligent agent that was required. Now, to your point, hey, we're on Mars or another planet, and we don't know who it was, but you're still going to immediately conclude that an intelligent agent was required because you're now observing this self-replicating robot that has programming controls and obvious engineering requirements that, I mean, just from basic intelligence on your side of the equation, is there's no way that this self-replicating robot could be built without the intelligent agent. So the point when you drive this back to whether or not you kick the can to another solar system or another galaxy, the same requirements of the root engineering and programming for that self-replication still, and the capacity to do so still requires intelligence and an intelligent agent. And in the context of life on Earth, per your and everybody else's position, there was no form of life as we know it that existed prior to our existence or life on our planet's existence. So just because we don't know who it was or can't, say, oh, we don't have a picture of who designed X, doesn't, just like the self-replicating robot, still doesn't remove it being stark evidence for the fact that the intelligent agent was there. Do you agree or disagree with that?
Right, I totally agree. I'm not saying that it rules out a designer. I don't argue against intelligent design. I argue against the type of designer one
is direct
would
evidence
propose
for. Not
is
rules
doing
out,
the design.
direct evidence for.
I'm not. Well, not necessarily. Again, we're not entirely sure what could have happened. Even though the probability is small, it could have happened that way. But again, I'm not ruling out any possibility based on the evidence we have now. We don't have all the data as to what could have happened, if it could have happened naturally or naturally by means of some kind of agency. But I'm not necessarily arguing against the possibility of an agency. I'm arguing against the possibility of an agency for which we have no evidence that they could exist in the way they're being described. So a deity, for example,
okay. So could
we have no evidence that
hang on.
something could exist in that. Yeah.
If you found the robot on Mars, and I told you that it made itself, what would your response be?
Right. I would have to again do some investigations, maybe try to build my own simpler versions to see how this could have come into being, and then I would realize, okay, the mechanisms by which this is done is building it this way, and then we can
No, hang on.
Okay, this was designed.
Hang on,
and it was done.
You're trying to you're circumventing the point here. Okay, is there any robot on this planet, our planet, that you would ever conclude could have created itself without an intelligent agent having been our root requirement? Any robot on this planet, could it possibly exist without an intelligent agent having been required?
Right. I don't know of any robot that can do that. No.
Okay. So now we go to Mars and we find a robot that has extremely similar functions to ones that we have on Earth. And then I say, hey, this robot that's amazingly has similar types of functions as to ones that we have here on Earth. Would you now think it is a remotely plausible conclusion that there mustn't at some point have been an intelligent agent which built the original robot that now has the ability to self-replicate?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to conclude an intelligent agent, but it has to be an intelligent agent that itself is possible.
Okay, so, but that robot is undeniable evidence for the intelligent agent, correct?
Yeah, once not just looking at it, but investigating it and seeing, okay, this was indeed designed by an agency. Fine, yes, this is done by an agency. But right. As to the agency itself, it needs to be an agency that is possible. I'm not arguing against intelligent design whatsoever. Yeah.
We're talking about which one is the more rational conclusion, and is the points that are being made by me and many others that are dismissed as the evidence which the vast majority of atheists claim does not exist for the intelligent designer. If, even though, because the point I'm making is in the context of Mars. Mars is abandoned. There's a self-replicating robot. We have absolutely zero method by which to determine who was, or the exact process by which they built these robots that we're now observing. Yet, by looking at their functions, we can quickly and easily determine that all of these necessary and independent parts could not possibly have built themselves. And it's like, okay, cool. We know beyond doubt, if we find a freaking robot on another planet, there must have been an intelligent agent. Why then, when we look at life on Earth, which has exponentially more complicated nanotech and coding and programming and logic rules and all of these different components that in any other context we would not conclude could exist without an intelligent agent, why then is it not rational, reasonable, logical, plausible, and probable to conclude that they serve as direct evidence for the intelligent agent and result in exactly what would occur on Mars if we found the robot, which is, if you think this robot built itself, you're an idiot and you're living in a fantasy land. But in the context of life, the literally exact opposite conclusion is put forth as the more realistic conclusion, and the person who believes in the opposite is the one that's being unreasonable. Emo, you there? I think Emo, I think you're on mute, buddy, if you're trying to respond.
Am I back on?
Yeah,
I think I'm on now.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Right. So instead of just just making a deductive argument as to this thing must have been designed, we need to go the further step into finding out how. And if life were designed in on Earth, for example, and there is a way to investigate this, we may try to build it ourselves, so then we can find out how it was designed, and then we would know what type of agency would be required. So it would be most likely an agency who behaves like us or has the same abilities like us. We won't propose an agency for which we don't have any evidence for. So, for example, if we find a watch in the sand, we at no point would conclude that a god must have done it, although it's not beyond a god to do so if one exists. Or we wouldn't conclude that any kind of supernatural being is doing this. We would conclude that it was maybe another human being like us who has that capability of doing that kind of thing. And if anything, if we look at how human beings build the nanomachines and so on that you were talking about, we would have to conclude that whatever this designer was, it was a designer like us, acting in it may be limited in the same way like us and build things like us to get life in the way it is. Because the only parallel we have to constructing life is maybe what biochemists would do when they built nanocars and so on. That's the only parallel we have as to the logic, agency building something like life.
By that logic, then the Coke can that humans design isn't designed by humans, because we're not like a Coke can. We have the ability, because of intelligence, you have the ability to create all sorts of things that A, don't yet exist, and B, can be devised for a never existing prior outcome, or not prior existing outcome. And so to limit the limit the actions of a intelligent agent to those parameters requires completely ignoring the things that humans create with their intelligence on a daily, if not minute by minute basis. I mean, you're completely suspending the original thought capability of an intelligent agent, a sentient intelligent agent. Do you not see that? Go ahead, man.
Well, basically what I was saying is that the only a priori knowledge we have of agencies being able to do things are, well, humans and other animals with similar mental faculty or similar kind of intelligence. So that's why we need to, if we need to posit that maybe some kind of supernatural thing is taking place, then we need evidence that the supernatural thing is taking place. The mechanism we need to at least observe some parallel that the mechanism that we're proposing can do what we're proposing it can do. The only thing we have now is biological agents, or maybe computers or whatever, robots, being able to do stuff and build stuff. So they have to have some kind of physical body and a physical means of constructing things, as opposed to a supernatural something for which that is the thing we don't have evidence for. So if we're proposing that, then
is digital information,
I'm not ruling it out, but it would be speculation.
Is digital information physical? Is it material or immaterial?
The information itself, is it not stored in the physical components?
What it's stored in
is it not part of the physical component?
What it's stored in is not relevant to the information itself. The expression of it might be through a physical medium, but the information itself, is it material or immaterial? In the context of what we're leveraging right now to have this conversation.
Well, it to me it seems to be physical. I don't see a means by which information can be non-physical and that like exist.
No, I said
in a non-physical sense. I don't really see how that could happen.
I said material or immaterial.
Oh, you said material. Yeah. By immaterial, but I know material you mean physical stuff, and immaterial you mean like metaphysical stuff.
No, I don't mean metaphysical. I mean,
okay.
So for example, light is considered immaterial. It has no mass, right? But nobody denies that light exists, even though it is immaterial. the information, for example, stolen in an old school punch card, the information was not the plastic. The information was the holes where there was literally nothing. And it was derived from the ability to interpret and translate the semantic information that was housed inside of the syntax of the binary code. And now the outcome, the medium with which contains information, and the outcome can be physical, but the elements that enable it to occur in terms of the prescriptive information that's required are immaterial. And the medium which housed it is not relevant. Now, in the context of the creator, for example, the limitations you're trying to place on them requiring a physical form in the context that we're talking about does not apply to the immaterial element of the equation that enables life to exist and is the single most important component of what enables life to exist, which is the prescriptive information as well as the organized structure which accounts for the foreknowledge of the end outcome. And as we are discovering more and more in the context of quantum mechanics, we are now discovering that the measurement component is not limited to the quantum level. It applies all the way up to the macro level. And they discovered this last year. And when you think that if something that is immaterial can directly impact the physical, and we have now proven that beyond doubt all the way up to retrocausality and rewriting of time in the context of the measurement equation or measurement problem, then we now have proof beyond doubt that the immaterial can be affected by the material and vice versa. So where I'm going with all that is trying to limit the creator to the purely physical in order to create the outcomes that we observe in the physical is not looking at the big picture of what is now known. Go ahead, man.
Okay. So in the same way, you would argue, for example, that observing that certain um, chemical structures can, but that usually associated with life can't form naturally, doesn't follow that the entire life form can be constructed that way. Um, I see no evidence that the immaterial, or whatever a god is, could construct or build things in the way that creationists would say that they did stuff, or that they can be able to manipulate matter in the way that they say it can. So
saying
yeah,
because
so that's what I'm saying. If we have some kind of
saying that this component can form is like saying because rocks exist, a 2,000 mile long 10-foot wall, it's reasonable to conclude that wall could build itself because a rock exists. I mean, I make this point on a regular basis. In no other context would it be considered rational that it is not the logical, plausible, and probable conclusion that the intelligent agent was not just a possibility, but the requirement for something to exist. And to, cool, this boulder fell off the top of a mountain, shattered into a bazillion pieces. Now there's a crap load of stones. You come back a year later and there's a wall, and you say, well, that's interesting because those rocks were there. That's why this wall is now here. I mean, that's the direct equivalent. Oh yeah, I mean, if you could manipulate gravity and through an undirected process and had the energy to physically move All right, I'm back, everybody. Can y'all hear me? Not sure what happened there. All the power in my house went out for about 30 seconds. Had to reboot everything. That was annoying. Emo, all right, I'm back, everybody. Can y'all hear me? All right, so audio's coming through. Sweet. Emo, are you still there? Well, anyway, well, folks, I appreciate everybody who stayed for my my random tangents. Anybody else want to come on while we're still talking about this topic? You there, Emo?
Yeah, sorry about the interruption, man. Out there.
No, it was me.
Internet.
No, that's interesting. Yours went out. My power went out.
Here in Grenada.
Do you have anything you wanted to talk about, Emo?
Right. So basically, I just want to explain my specific position. I am an atheist, which means that I don't believe in gods, at least the way they're described. But I don't reject intelligent design. I know it sounds strange, but I do sincerely believe that if a designer does exist, it is limited in some ways, that there are certain it can't do, or it would do it in a way that is somewhat indistinguishable from what we would find
You're breaking up real bad, Emo.
So yeah, so for example, let's look at for example, like we trial and error going on until we get a better and better plane, until we get a space shuttle and so on. And it seems like that's the way the designer is doing. If one does exist, it seems like the way it's doing it. It's doing it trial and error. It would start with the microbes, and then it would advance on those until it gets to is that a bit better?
I'm not sure. You broke up there for a second, but I heard what you're saying in the context.
Is that any better?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Oh man. Is this any better?
I can hear you.
Boy.
If you're not hearing me, I'm talking back to you, man. I can hear you. Okay.
Let me see. Is this better now? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine, man.
I wonder if I'm still connected.
Yeah, you are, man. All right, everybody. I just realized I've been talking for 3 hours and 32 minutes, and getting a little bit tired. I think I'm gonna.
All right. So yeah, what I was saying is.
So right, I appreciate everybody hanging out for this discussion and listening to my tangents and back and forth with all these people. Appreciate it to Emo and for coming on, having these conversations and back and forth and discussing these different components of the equation. I'm starving because I've been talking for 3 hours and 33 minutes. I had to take a break, but I hope you all come back for whenever my next live stream is and future debates and such. And I appreciate again for all your support of my channel, and hope you guys will stay logical, plausible, and always look for what is probable.